Number 10. Julia Tofana. In the 1600s, women who were left under the control of malignant husbands who would physically harm and control them was a rather common issue, and the general rule was that unless your spouse passed away, that was the only time a woman could be granted her freedom. The active contents inside the vial with the artwork of St. Nicholas were unknown, but mostly it was filled with arsenic, lead, and possibly belladonna. It was colorless, tasteless, and therefore easy to mix with many other substances like wine or water. It was called by the name Aqua Tofana, and it was named after the suspected Julia Tofana, as she was the main distributor and ringleader of this secret sauce. The actual creator might have actually been another woman who was caught later on. The poisoning of Aqua Tofana would go unnoticed, as its symptoms would mimic other illnesses that were prominent at the time. First dosage would mimic a cold, the third dosage digestive issues, and the fourth was death. It was so effective and helpful that when the poison was used in a slow active state, it would give the victims the assumption that they were dying and would write a will and repent. And if the provider of the poison changed their mind, the antidote was simply lemon juice and vinegar. Although the invention of this poison substance was eventually discontinued as so many had been caught with the subject, it lasted for the length that it did due to the assumption that it was a cosmetic, when really it was for women of this time a vial of liberation and freedom. Number 9. Vladimir Demikov. A very famous Soviet scientist by the name of Vladimir Demikov was known for his innovation, organ transplants, which had saved many lives in the medical world by extending life from near-death events. However, how he came to this is just as disturbing and concerning as it was revolutionary and innovative, and he would transplant a number of vital organs between dogs. But then he decided to experiment even further by sewing together a two-headed dog. He and his assistants would attempt to operate not just a few times, but over 24 times to create a functioning two-headed dog, and it was at the 24th time it was widely publicized. It was even featured on Life magazine, and unsurprisingly was considered a very dark, horrifying creation that had been beheld. He sewed together the head of a neck of a small dog named Shavka onto the neck of a large stray German shepherd named Brodyaga. The mad scientist created an unnatural creation at a disturbing cost. For the surgery itself, Demikov amputated Shavka the lower body below the forelegs, keeping her heart and lungs connected until just before the transplant. Then he attached Shavka to the upper body of a corresponding incision of Brodyaga's neck. The operation lasted 3.5 hours, although both could function, and here Shavka ended up dying as she was not attached to Brodyaga's stomach, so whatever she ate fell out. And tragically, the two animals died 4 days later due to the damage of a crucial vein. The previous pair of dogs lasted for a month before they too died in a fatal end, and Vladimir also had no intention to stop his animal cruelty experiments and would continue trying until his death. Number 8. MK Ultra. Project MK Ultra was an illegal human experimentation program designed and undertaken by the CIA and intended to develop procedures and identifying drugs that could be used during interrogations to weaken people and force confessions through brainwashing and psychological torture. MK Ultra used numerous methods to manipulate its subjects' mental state and brain functions, such as a covert administration of high doses of psychoactive drugs and other chemicals without the subject's consent, electric shocks, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and sexual and other forms of torment. MK Ultra was preceded by Project Artichoke, and it was organized through the CIA's office and coordinated with the US Army's biological warfare labs. The program engaged in illegal activities, including the use of US and Canadian citizens as unwitting test subjects. Investigative efforts were hampered by CIA Director Richard Helm's order that all MK Ultra files be destroyed in 1973. The Church Committee and Rockefeller Commission's investigations relied on the sworn testimony of direct participants and on the small number of documents that survived Helm's order. In 1977, a Freedom of Information Act requested uncovered a cache of 20,000 documents relating to MK Ultra, which led to Senate hearings, but some of the surviving information about MK Ultra was declassified in 2001. Number 7. Philip Zimbardo. An American psychologist and a professor at Stanford University, was known for his involvement, leadership, and administration on the research of the Stanford Prison Experiment. He was heavily criticized as the experiment was seen unethical and scientific reasons. The Stanford Prison Experiment was a psychological experiment conducted to stimulate a prison environment to examine the effects of situational variables on participants' reaction and behaviors. Participants were recruited from the local community with an ad in the newspaper offering $15 per day to male students who wanted to participate in a psychological study of prison life. Keep in mind, $15 back then is roughly $114 today. Volunteers were chosen after assessments of psychological stability and then randomly assigned to being prisoners or prison guards. Over the following 5 days, psychological harm of the prisoners by the guards became increasingly brutal. After psychologists scientist Christina Maslach visited to evaluate the conditions. She was upset to see how study participants were behaving, and she confronted Zimbardo, and he ended the experiments on the 6th day. The SBE had been referenced and heavily criticized as an example of an unethical psychological experiment as a harm inflicted on the participants in this and the other experiments in the post-World War II era. Because of this experiment, it prompted American universities to improve their ethical requirements and institutional review on human experiments to prevent them from being similarly harmed. The goal of Zimbardo's primary reason for the conducting of the experiment was to focus on the power of roles, rules, symbols, group identity, and situational validation of behavior that generally would repulse ordinary individuals. But with one positive result of the study is that it altered the way the US prisons are run. For example, juveniles accused of federal crimes are no longer housed before trial with adult prisoners due to the risk of violence against them.
Number 6, the Mad Doctor. I love doctors. Shout out to the people working in the medical field right now. I appreciate you. I couldn't even imagine the horror that is medical school though. We all know my track record for reading, and hours upon hours of studying would just be bad for my health. I gotta squeeze more video game time in there, it's just how I work, man. However, one doctor I would not want to cross is Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. He is most likely the inspiration for a lot of horror movies. A serial unaliver, said to have been performing surgeries on animals at a young age, which, again, doing some freaky deaky stuff to animals as a kid is like the red flag of red flags. It's like the only red flag. If that wasn't enough, he used to steal cadavers from the university he was studying at and doing all kinds of not nice things to them, naughty, bad. Having a clear obsession with medical practices and anatomy probably was helpful in disposing of his victims. And like something from Tales of the Crypt Keeper, that's exactly what he did. He constructed a large house, or building really, with trap doors, secret tunnels, and a lot of rooms. A basement where he could dispose of his victims. He would later then open this house of horrors up as a hotel where unknowing people would come to meet their doom.
Yes, Tales of the Crypt Keeper. Come check in to the Hotel of Doom.
Number 5. Bad Comrade. Stosif Jalin was the leader of the Soviet Union for probably too long. A man who worked his way up the political chain until General Secretary meant leader, which, if you look it up, it's kinda crazy. That itself is a crazy story. He's responsible for a great loss of life. It is estimated in the range of 40 million people. Ooh, yikes. Most spooky evil dudes usually go after an enemy, to someone they consider to not be part of them. He did do this, but a lot of his own people sadly met their ends from the Red Menace too. Organized and deliberate purges of people and famines to starve people. It's safe to say he is and was and always will be one of the worst humans to ever walk the face of the earth. To put it in perspective, Jalin's son was a soldier in World War II, and after being captured by German forces, the Germans thought they had one on the boss. Heck, this was a get out of jail free card, right? Well, when a prisoner trade was proposed by the Germans, Jalin laughed at only how an evil communist could, and denied the trade. His son would later perish in a POW camp shortly after. What a monster.
You think you trade with me? Keep him, I don't want.
Number 4. Fine white powder. Oh, to be in Miami in the mid-1980s. If I had one wish, it would be to spend a summer night in the neon-soaked beaches of Miami under strict laws enforced by a president who didn't know what was going on right underneath his nose. If you were around back then you probably got to experience something like that. Or at least in my fever dreams. I hope so. But as much as I'd like to be Tony Montana with all that sugar on his desk, I know it's bad for my health. Speaking of bad for your health, Pablo Escobar. I know, that's where I went with that. Probably the most ruthless criminal ever to live on planet Earth. Pablo was a poor man born in a poor country, but ended up being one of, if not the richest man on planet Earth. His lucrative distribution of adult sugar in the 80s made him very wealthy. It also made him very dangerous, as he was willing to do whatever to get his way. Extortion, bribing, bombing, just about anything you can think of. Oh yeah, he was one bad dude. He had so much money that he had to bury it all over Colombia. Every once in a while some of his buried treasure pops up. And as much as I want a quick million in US cash, I'll just put it back where it came from. Oh Dios mío, lo siento Pablo. Number 3. Al Capone. Another ruthless criminal, and honestly, Capone walked so gangsters like Pablo could run. Part of the ruthless Italian mafia that was the outfit, Capone worked his way through the ranks during 1920s Prohibition America, earning millions in his time where really just $100 could stretch a long way. Capone is noted for his violent behavior throughout his life and the many accidents he caused directly or indirectly. Prohibition and the Depression were hard times for a lot of folks in America. However, the media and the people of Chicago at first always wanted to see what the lavish gangster was up to, as his criminal life became somewhat publicized. Most likely due to his wealth. The dude was rich. He eventually would get arrested and sent to Alcatraz, which was probably the worst prison in America, or the best Call of Duty Zombies map, depending on how you look at things. I look at things through a Call of Duty way, so Number 2, Gavrilo Princip. That might not be a name that you're familiar with, but it was the man who unalived Franz Ferdinand, which started World War I, which caused World War II, which caused the Cold War, which caused the collapse of Soviet Russia, and it's why you live in a post-war globalist world with markets developing rapidly in the cyber world. Except maybe the whole thing in Ukraine, watch out for that. Kinda crazy to think how all that could come from one wrong turn and a guy seizing an opportunity. But this also means he's kind of responsible, in a way, for all the bad stuff that happened in those times as well. So maybe don't seize the day, I'm not sure. Just don't be ruthless criminals, guys. Watch our videos instead. Although I could blame him for failing my math test in high school. Yeah, we'll go with that. Number 1, Mao Zedong. I'd like to come out here and tell you all about the chairman of China, but that simply is just too hot for TV, and if it's too hot for TV, it's too hot for YouTube. Basically, he was the dictator of communist China and is responsible for many lives lost. It's estimated to be somewhere in the range of 60 to 80 million people. Whoa! Dude was down bad, the definition of down bad, and although many were told to adore him, there's still a great many people who remember the terrible things he's done. From Beijing to Hong Kong, there's not a person around who doesn't know who he is. If being a no-good, rotten person was an Olympic sport, he would have gold medals coming out of his ears.
Number 10, Stubbins Firth. Stubbins Firth was a University of Pennsylvania researcher fixated on one particular scientific scheme, and a very dangerous one at that. As a trainee doctor, he became obsessed with the idea that yellow fever was non-contagious, to the extent that he went to great extremes trying to prove it. Armed only with a trusty blade and his incessant desire to find the truth, Firth sliced opened his arms and smeared vomit from yellow fever patients into his wounds. When that made no difference, he poured the vomit into his eyes, drank some of it, fried the stuff, and breathed in the fumes. And in a final act of madness, he covered himself with blood, urine, and saliva from infected patients. Ultimately, Firth proved this theory so far as he didn't get sick. However, we now know that this was as much down to him making samples from the late-stage patients who were past the point of contagion. In other words, Firth swallowed infected vomit but didn't shed much new light on the disease. So he did all that for nothing. Number 9, Jose Delgado. University of Madrid graduate Jose Delgado may have received a prestigious professorship at Yale University, but his research was on dealing with mind control. While at Yale in the 50s-60s, Delgado inserted electrode implants into the brains of primates and used a remote control that gave off radio frequencies to make the animals perform complicated movements. Later, he placed the implants into the brain of a bull and got into the ring with the beast using his transmitter to stop charging before it reached him. Aside the animal cruelty, he even tried these experiments on 25 people and wired them up. Behaviorally, it only induced the people's anger and impacted more towards their aggression, but he kept striving for a way to achieve mind control, and even once said, "We must electronically control the brain, and someday armies and generals will be controlled by electric stimulation of the brain." I don't know, I guess it doesn't work. Number 8, Paracelsus. Switzerland Paracelsus' contributions to toxology were based heavily in astrology, and he is quite well known for offering the community a wide array of useful ideas and innovations. He was a pioneer in several aspects of the medical revolutions of the Renaissance, emphasizing the value of observation in combination with received wisdom. However, for all of his use, he also thought he might be able to create a homunculi, or small humans, who stood no more than a foot or so height and performed actions very similar to Gollum. Not Gollum from Lord of the Rings, but pretty close. He is said to have run away after turning on their master. The homunculus creation used bits of people using semen and hair. To him, the fully grown homunculi was supposedly greatly skilled in art and could create giants, dwarves, and other marvels. As though they are art, they are born, and therefore art is embodied and inborn in them, and they needed to learn it from, well, no one. Well, it didn't end up working because they ended up dying right away. Number 7, Peter Neubauer. Clinical psychologists led by Peter Neubauer ran a secret experiment in which they separated twins and triplets from each other, and adopted them out as singlets. The experiment, said to have been partly funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, came into light when 3 identical triplet brothers accidentally found each other in 1980. They had no idea they had siblings, and David Kelman, one of the triplets, felt really angry towards the experiment, quoting, "We were robbed of 20 years together," said Kelman in the Orlando Sentinel article. His brother, Edward Gallen, sadly took his own life in 1995 at his home. The child psychiatrist who headed up the study, Peter Nober and Viola Bernard, showed no remorse according to news reports, going as far as saying they thought that they were doing something good for the kids, separating them so that they could develop their own individual personalities. As for what Nober learned from his evil experiment, that anyone's guess as a result of the controversial study are being stored in an archive at Yale University, and they say they can't actually reveal it until 2066. Number 6. Phalaris and Perleos of Athens. Throughout history, humans in general have created an enclave of many extraordinary things, and as civilizations go, for some reason in our distant past, they had an obsession of creating agonizing means and the inflictions of others. Perleos of Athens had created something that at first glance may seem like a work of art, but its uses had been a thing of torment: the brazen bull. The beautiful bronze statue casted in ancient Greece was invented between 570 and 554 BC. The statue was actually commissioned by the reign of Phalaris, an evil tyrant in Sicily. So many would think that he's actually the real inventor, or more or less had the idea. This tyrant was also known for eating new as his new cruel torment device, and the bull was cast hollow and was used as a fire would be built below, and its design was that it would be opened and a person would be forced inside. The fire would start underneath the person and it would burn as the smoke and steam would escape from the bull's nose. Incense was placed inside to counteract the smell of burnt flesh, and it is said that it was a series of tubes built inside the statue to design to distort the screams of the victim and make them sound like an animal. Phalaris was a piece of work as he wanted to test the sound system of the bull, that he even pushed Perleos, the man who created the bull for him, into the belly and lit a fire under him. And then he later released him before he pushed him off a cliff. But by sheer karma, Phalaris died in a bull himself as the city was taken over by Telemachus in 554 BC. Number 5. Lytle S. Adams. After hearing about the vicious attacks of Pearl Harbor on the radio, Lytle S. Adams developed a unique plan of vengeance against the Japanese Imperial Army with the Bat Bomb. The bomb consisted a bomb-shaped casting over 1,000 compartments, each containing a hibernating Mexican free-tailed bat with a small timed incendiary bomb attached. Dropped from a bomber at dawn, the castings would deploy a parachute in mid-flight and open a release of bats, which would then disperse to eaves and attics in a 20-40 mile radius. Adams stated that the bat was the lowest form of animal life, and that until now, reasons for its creations have remained unexplained. He went on to espouse that bats were created by God to wait this hour to play their part in the scheme of free human existence to frustrate any attempt of those who dared desecrate our way of this life. This weird device was then of course proved by President Roosevelt, who's remarked that his friend wasn't crazy, but the idea was worth looking into. Either way, after the conducted of a few tests, the program was eventually cancelled after it was estimated a use of $2 million, or in today's value $32 million, was wasted on this invention. When it comes to war, humans showcase the worst of the worst if it means of expanding their nation's political planning, and if you're in the military, there's an internal conflict to fill in your nationalism and your internal duty to serve the country, and you forget your economical issues. When it comes to the invention of war, as it has been showcased throughout history time and time again, even in current unfortunate events, the creation leads to genocide by means of invention of different kinds of warfare. Developed by Fritz Haber, who was a professor at the University of Karlsruhe, was a brilliant chemist who invented the industrial scale productions of ammonia-based fertilizer. Alongside Frederick Guthrie, the two was noted as the ones who weaponized and synthesized a vescent chemical warfare agent called mustard gas, a widely used weapon used during World War I by both sides of the conflict with particularly harmful and deadly effects. It was responsible for the 1,205,655 non-fatal casualties and 91,198 deaths. The effects range from minor symptoms such as skin irritation and conjunctivitis to severe lung damage when inhaled. Despite the horrific use of mustard gas during World War I, there was a silver lining: the discovery of the first modern chemotherapeutic agent based on observations of World War I survivors exposed to mustard gas. The studies eventually launched an era of cancer chemotherapy research. Number 3. Oliver Winchester. An American businessman and politician named Oliver Winchester was best known for his founding, manufacturing, the marketing of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, aka the Winchester rifle. The first official Winchester rifle was a model in 1866. Repeating rifles was not widely used until after the war, when they became increasingly popular with the civilians. Military authorities concentrated primarily on perfecting breech-loading single-shot rifles for many more years. His ownership was then passed to his son, who died of TB, and his wife Sarah Winchester ended up moving to California with inheritance as she began to make the famed Winchester house a haunted mystery house due to her fear of spirits being murdered by the rifle. Number 2. Dow and Company. Originally developed to simply enhance the growth of soybeans, Agent Orange was weaponized and used extensively during the Vietnam War. During the war, Dow, Monsanto, and other companies were compelled by the US government to produce Agent Orange under the US Defense Production Act of 1950. Used in large quantities, it was a powerful herbicide used by the United States to deforest the jungles and destroy Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army crops. The United States military sprayed upon up to 20 million million gallons of herbicides over Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia from 1961 through 1971, covering over 4.5 million acres. Agent Orange was often proven afterwards to cause very serious health problems for both Vietnamese people and returning U.S. military personnel and their families. Among were rashes, birth defects, and severe neurological problems, as well as cancer. This military action has caused the nation of Vietnam. Since then, the country has reported over 400,000 of their people were maimed and killed by the harm of the herbicides, that 500,000 of their children have been born with birth defects caused by the exposure of Agent Orange. The U.S. courts, of course, have constantly ruled that Dow and other manufacturers bear no responsibility for the development and the use of Agent Orange during the Vietnam War and have dismissed all legal claims to the contrary. And finally, number 1, Oppenheimer. An American theoretical physicist and director of the Manhattan Project Los Alamos Laboratory during World War II, is often called the father of the atomic bomb, causing the destruction and devastation of the Japanese as it resulted the tragedies of 200,000 civilians and military personnel. The ethics of these bombings and the roles in Japan's surrender are subjects of debate. Oppenheimer did important research of the theoretical astronomy as well as the quantum field theory and the extensive of quantum electric dynamics. But with his interests that led him to the developments of these weapons still hold to this day dire consequences on the lives that it would affect. In a very famous quote to his recognition, he has said, "If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once in the sky, that would be like the splendor of the mighty one. Now I have become death, the shatter of worlds." In a meeting he had with President Truman, he was distraught at the invention as it was now readily usable at the hands of practically anyone. And President Truman was infuriated at Oppenheimer when he said, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands," responding that he, Truman, bore sole responsibility for the decision on the atomic bomb against the Japanese, which later Truman said, "I don't want to see that son of a bee in this office ever again." The Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons aimed to reduce the spread of nuclear weapons, but its effectiveness has been questioned. Modernization of weapons continue to this day. Bombs alike have been proved with its massive casualties and results to devastation, eradication, genocide of innocent people, and the tragedy of wars it inhibits in our modern times.
Number 10. Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth Bathory, commonly referred to as the Blood Countess, occupies a pretty creepy place in history as a Hungarian noblewoman with a notorious reputation. She is believed to be one of the most prolific female serial killers in history, earning her eerie nickname from the gruesome practice of bathing in the red of her victims. This ritual was apparently rooted in her belief that it could preserve her youthfulness, and it sounds like some pretty extreme anti-aging to me. Operating during the late 16th and early 17th centuries within the walls of her castle, now located in modern-day Slovakia, Bathory subjected an estimated 650 girls to unimaginable horrors. Her reign of terror reached its thankful end on December 30th, 1610, when Elizabeth, along with 4 accomplices, faced arrest following an investigation into the disturbing rumors surrounding her actions. Despite the severity of the accusations, though, a lack of concrete evidence prevented the claims from being substantiated. However, the absence of solid proof did not grant her leniency, and she was confined to her castle until her eventual passing. Her evil deeds and the whole blood-soaked castle deal make her a heavyweight in the true crime scene. It's a legitimate horror story with more questions than answers. Would probably make a great horror film, though. And in at number 9 today is Ma Barker. Ma Barker, a notorious figure in US criminal history, served as the leader of the feared Barker Gang, which her sons were also a part of. Gaining the title of the FBI's public enemy #1, Barker orchestrated a series of robberies, murders, and kidnappings across the American Midwest in the early 1930s. Her life came to a pretty explosive end in 1935 during a prolonged standoff in her Florida hideout, setting a record as the longest standoff in FBI history. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI's first director, once described her as the most vicious, dangerous, and resourceful criminal brain of the last decade. Hoover's description added to Ma Barker's mysterious reputation, solidifying her reputation as one of the most evil women of all time. Number 8. Belle Gunness. Belle Gunness holds the disturbing title of one of America's worst female serial killers. Even before considering her terrifying actions, she was already an imposing and physically intimidating woman, standing 6 feet tall and weighing over 200 pounds. It was alleged that she was responsible for the passing of her husbands, younglings, numerous suitors, boyfriends, and even her own daughters, Myrtle and Lucy. Belle's motive was pretty simple: greed. She gained income by stealing life insurance and assets from her victims. Reports suggest her victim count exceeds 20, with some claiming it could be over 100. Inconsistencies in her post-mortem examination, such as the reported height being 2 inches shorter than Belle's 6 feet, contributed to her becoming a figure in American criminal folklore, often compared to a female Bluebeard, because people will make things up and just run with it sometimes. Number 7. Griselda Blanco. Born in 1943, Griselda Blanco, known by her aliases of La Madrina or the Black Widow, emerged as a frightening figure in the criminal underworld. Hailing from Colombia, she etched her name in history as one of the most ruthless and feared queenpins ever known. Blanco's notoriety reached its peak as a key player in the notorious Medellin cartel, a criminal empire synonymous with violence and illicit trade. What sets Blanco apart is her unexpected role as a mentor to none other than Pablo Escobar. However, as fate would have it, their relationship eventually soured, paving the way for a rivalry that would echo through criminal history. Blanco's criminal empire revolved around the transportation of a certain illegal powdery substance from the fields of Colombia to the streets of the United States. This calculated operation, coupled with her alleged involvement in up to 200 people being ushered to the pearly gates, showcased Blanco's audacity and cunning in a male-dominated realm. Her ability to not only navigate but dominate such a perilous environment proved her prowess as a criminal mastermind. Following a stint behind bars, Blanco's life met a chilling end on September 3rd, 2012, when she was wiped out in a hail of lead, leaving a void in the criminal landscape she once ruled. I'm all for girl power, but let's just put that energy somewhere else, shall we? Cool.
Number 6, the Burke and Hare. Body snatching was very common in the ages of the pre-19th century, as the only legal way to get bodies for dissection was those of executed criminals. Since it was difficult to get on the waiting list for these bodies, anatomists took buying bodies from the grave robbers or even doing it themselves, up until the students and the anatomists would carry out their own raids in graveyards, acquiring cadavers as and when they could. William Hare and his friends William Burke found ways of delivering fresh corpses to their boarding houses without actually having to steal a body, which is that they would smother more than a dozen lodgers at that boarding house, and then they would sell their bodies to the anatomist Robert Knox, and Knox didn't notice or care that the bodies that he received were recently fresh, as it was imperative to his job. Burke was later charged and died for his crimes, and the case spurred the British government to loosen the restrictions on dissection. The scandal led to the Anatomy Act of 1832, where they made a great number of cadavers legally available for education purposes. Typically, these bodies would be from those who died in an asylum and had no relatives or any ways to cover for funeral costs. Number 5, Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was in charge of the CIA's MK Ultra project in the 1950s. This project's goal was to investigate techniques that would crush the human psyche to the point that it would admit to anything. I guess in some ways it's kind of like the truth serum but with psychology. More specifically, he too also wanted to find a way to do mind control like Delgado in number 9. He wanted to find ways with the CIA to induce the behaviors of enemies, but in these cases, Sidney went his way to by dosing unsuspecting subjects with LSD, experimenting with illegal drugs, and sought out all sorts of exciting ways to poison people, including Fidel Castro, as he is the man behind the infamous poison cigar. If you guys know Stranger Things, the suspicion of Eleven getting her powers was from her mom being induced with LSD, chemicals that were thought to be creating of powerful abilities, but unlike Stranger Things, it definitely helped open someone's mind up, but not like moving stuff with one's mind. Number 4, Sergei Burko-Honeko. Although he's been credited with helping bring about the most important advances with open heart surgery, his gruesome act was on experimentations on animals, also animal cruelty. Sergei wasn't content with slicing up animals after they died. More specifically, not only did he not like to wait, but he also didn't like the animals to die, even after they've been decapitated. In the late 1930s, him and his team undertook a series of experiments as part of which they removed a canine's head and kept it alive away from its body by hooking it up to an air and blood supply apparatus. He would also have another hound had all the blood drawn from its body, only later to be brought back to life by the Soviet Frankenstein. Number 3, Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist and a lieutenant general of Unit 731, a biological warfare unit of the Imperial Japanese Army during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Ishii is remembered as the father of biological warfare. Under his watch, thousands of captives were infected with deadly diseases and thousands more were impacted by chemicals on the battlefield. Ishii performed a bunch of experiments that had nothing to do with chemical warfare, including forced abortions, vivisections, and simulated strokes. Humans were also used as a living test cases for grenades and flamethrowers, and prisoners were injected with inoculations of diseases disguised as vaccinations to study their effects. Because life is totally fair, Ishii was never charged with war crimes, and he died peacefully at his home in Japan in the late 60s. Number 2, Joseph Mengele. Mengele gained notoriety chiefly for being one of the SS physicians who supervised the selections of arriving transports of prisoners, determining who was to be killed and who was to become a forced laborer, and for performing human experiments on camp inmates, amongst whom Mengele was known as the Angel of Death. Mengele was just a stone-cold killer, as he performed experiments on 3,000 sets of twins, and less than 30 survived his depraved antics. His experiments included, but sadly were not limited to, dyeing children's eyes to be a specific color, since he has an obsession with monochromatic eyes, sewing twins together to make them conjoined, and giving them gangrene. In fact, many of his evil deeds weren't scientific at all. He was just masochistic. He was reportedly smiling every time he took part of his selection process of sending arriving arrivals at camps on who were unfit for labor straight to the gas chambers. He died in 1976, and as he was never brought to justice for his crimes. Number 1. J. Marion Sims. Although he was known as the father of modern gynecology, Sims was gained much for his fame for doing experimental surgeries on slave women. Sims remained a controversial figure to this day because the condition he was treating the women, viscogenital fistula, caused terrible suffering. Women with fistulas, a tear between their private parts and their bladder, were incontinent and were often rejected by society. Sims performed the surgery without anesthesia, in part because anesthesia had only recently been discovered, and in part because Sims believed that operations were not painful enough to justify the trouble, which is what he said, but still regardless, the cruelty he bestowed on these women were not at all consented and manipulated the social institutions on slavery to perform human experiments, which by any standards is unacceptable. Like Irene of Athens. She ruled between 797 to 802 CE, and the untimely death of her husband caused the throne fell onto her, leaving her solely in charge. And during her regency with her son Constantine, Irene became very influential in government policies. Although she co-ruled with her son for 2 decades, she knew her son was an unpopular emperor, and the empress was an ambitious woman and wanted full control of the Byzantine Empire. With the help of some political allies, Irene led a conspiracy against her own son, but ultimately though the mother and son reconciled, but then again, it wasn't in the end. In 786, the public turned against Constantine after he decided to divorce his wife and marry his mistress instead, and so Irene took advantage of this and once again conspired against her son. In 797, Irene organized a conspiracy in which supporters gouged out her son's eyes, maiming him severely, and he was imprisoned and probably died shortly afterwards. With him out of the way, Irene proclaimed herself as the sole ruler, and Pope Leo III, already seeking to break links with the Byzantine Empire, used Irene's alleged unprecedented status as a female ruler of the Roman Empire to proclaim Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day of 800. Under the pretext though that a woman could not rule and so the throne of the Roman Empire was actually vacant, a revolt in 802 overthrew Irene and exiled her. The power-hungry woman remained in exile on the island of Lesbos, where she had to support herself by spinning wool. She remained on the island of Lesbos until she died a year later, and see, this is why you don't get power-hungry and order an execution on your own son by gouging his eyes out. Even if he didn't have many friends, it's not his fault. I mean, Rani of Jhansi, also known as Rani of Lakshmibai, sounds like a total baddie, maybe not to her enemies, as she was a major threat to them with her violent rage to defend. But hey, when people are occupied, resistance is justified, and she led the Great Indian Rebellion in 1857 against the British colonizers and their imperial government. Wait, this is so cool. According to historians, she threw herself into battle with the reins in her teeth and a sword in each hand, and she besieged a fort where she massacred every British man, woman, and child. Yes, it was terrible for her and many of the Indian resistance, but when it came to colonizers occupying indigenous land, not gonna lie, what do you expect? Like every rebellion of indigenous people who had to resort to violence to protect themselves from people taking over their land, it kinda makes sense. And Rani, who had been noted as the Joan of Arc, well, Joan of Indian Arc, for her leadership and brilliant military tactics on attacking the British forces. Even Sir Hugh Rose, commander of the British Navy, used artillery to disarm the rebellion, but still even took note of her leadership and commandment and was really astonished by it. She assumed regency in place of her adopted son and rallied forces with the help of the Tatia Tope. She died valiantly fighting against the British to her last breath, and not gonna lie, my kind of woman. What was that mean from Cowboy Bebop? I love that kind of woman that can kick my ass. Something like that. I mean, aside of a woman with the right intention and protecting her people, Queen Rana Valnona was a bit of the opposite. She was more of a tyrant than a ruler who had the intention to liberate her people. I mean, in reality, the only thing that the people need to be liberated from was from her. She had once ruled Madagascar and had no doubt she was as fierce as she would have done anything for her kingdom when it came to outsiders and people who came to her land by force. And you guessed it, I'm talking about European colonizers. You see, Queen Rana Valnona was the first to rule after her husband, King Radama, after he died. During her reign, she got her uncle executed to protect her power, and some records state that she had ended her own mother's life by subjecting her to extreme hunger. She self-proclaimed herself as ruler as a message by the gods, and when she ruled, she had the people's population go from 5 million to half that number. During the 33 years on her reign on the throne, she isolated the island and seized much of its trade and goodwill exchanged with the African people to the west. She also, with her critics, she forced them to eat poisoned chicken skin and vomit it back up. If they survived ingestion and regurgitated, they also proved that they were loyal to her, and if they died, it proved that they were secretly disloyal, and her deaths were warranted. It took the island nation decades to recover what was lost under her rule, and in her reign had killed and chopped off the heads of French and British missionaries and even boiled Christians of Madagascar alive. She killed her rivals in any way that she could and was just very picky, and considering the population was cut in half, she really did pull a Thanos.
Number 6. Christiana Edmonds. Christiana Edmonds, also known as the Chocolate Cream Killer, was an English woman with a really disturbing hobby. She would purchase chocolates, lace them with strychnine, a powerful and toxic chemical, and then return them to the shop. Unexpecting customers who bought those chocolates would naturally fall ill. In 1871, a tragic incident occurred when a young person passed away after consuming one of the poisoned chocolates. Now, following this, Edmonds escalated her campaign by sending parcels of her dangerous chocolates to notable individuals. As the police began linking the fatal and damaging outcomes to the chocolates, Edmonds attempted to deflect suspicion by sending parcels to herself in order to mislead the police. How intelligent. Once she was caught, Edmonds was initially sentenced to death, but her punishment was later changed to life imprisonment due to her mental illness. Number 5. Mary I of England. Born on February 18, 1516, Mary I held the throne as Queen of England and Ireland from July 1553 until her passing. As the only surviving child of the marriage between Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, Mary I's reign is notable for her brutal persecution of Protestants, earning her infamous moniker Bloody Mary. Her attempt to forcefully return England to Catholicism resulted in the forced passing of numerous prominent Protestants, contributing to a climate of fear and leading around 800 Protestants to flee the country, unable to return until her passing. During her reign, Bloody Mary implemented the heresy laws, which resulted in the burning of over 300 Protestants accused of heresy. Despite the widespread violence, Mary I was never prosecuted for her actions. However, after her passing on November 17, 1558, the winds of change swept through England, ushering away from her staunch Catholic policies. The efforts to re-establish Catholicism were ultimately reversed, marking a turning point in the religious landscape of England. Mary I's reign, entwined with religious strife and political turmoil, remains a complex chapter in history where power, ideology, and the consequences of persecution shape the course of a nation. Number 4. Wu Zetian. Between 665 and 690, Wu Zetian controlled China as empress through her husband, and later as empress dowager through her sons. However, in 690, she achieved a historic milestone by becoming empress, marking her as China's first and only official recognized female ruler. Wu Zetian maintained her authoritarian position from 690 until her passing in 705. Now, despite the significant achievements in expanding China's territory and establishing it as a powerful empire, her reign was unfortunately also marked by violence and bloodshed. Wu Zetian's rise to power was marked by a series of manipulative and ruthless tactics. She orchestrated the downfall of her political rivals, resorting to schemes such as false accusations, purges, anything to eliminate potential threats. While her success in building a powerful empire is acknowledged, she has faced enduring criticism for the ruthless tactics employed to do so. Number 3. Mary Ann Cotton. Mary Ann Cotton, who lived in the 1800s, left behind a criminal tale that's not all neatly documented. Back then, record keeping wasn't the greatest, so we're left with a bit of a puzzle when it comes to the exact details of her evil actions. But it's estimated that Cotton might have offed around 21 people. 3 of them were unlucky husbands, and a whopping 11 were her very own family. She had this not-so-friendly habit of using arsenic to bring their lives to an end, and then cashing in on their life insurance policies. The party came to a screeching halt, however, when she attempted this method on her stepson, Charles Edward Cotton, leading to her capture and the grand finale, a date with the executioner. Now, here's where it gets interesting. They gave her a short rope instead of the customary long one. This meant that instead of physics causing her neck to snap, she instead suffered a long, slow, agonizing suffocation. Number 2. Mary Piercy. Mary Piercy, born in 1866, lived in Kentish Town, North London, with her lover, Charles Creighton. Feeling unsatisfied with life, at the age of 24, Mary sought more, leading her to become romantically involved with a man named Frank Hogg. However, it seems that Frank was also already spoken for, being already married to his pregnant wife, Phoebe. The dark events unfolded on October 24, 1890, when a policeman discovered the almost severed body of a woman in Crossfield Road, Hampstead, along with a blood-stained pram. Mary's association with the crime drew attention when she displayed hysterical behavior at the mortuary while viewing the body of the deceased woman, later identified as Phoebe Hanelo, Frank Hogg's wife. The next day, the lifeless body of Hogg's daughter was found near Finchley Road, a mile away. This time, the cause was suffocation. As the police became more and more aware of the affair between Frank and Mary, they searched Mary's house and found broken furniture and bloodstains. Mary, seemingly unfazed, played the piano and sang loudly during the search. The police ended up uncovering an axe, 2 knives, blood-stained clothing, and love letters between the illicit couple. Mary's attempts to explain the stains as a result of taking out mice was met with understandable skepticism. The police gathered evidence from neighbors who had witnessed Mary wheeling a pram away from the house on the evening of October 24th and heard screams from her residence. The disturbing truth emerged during the trial at the Old Bailey in December 1890. Mary's defense claimed insanity, but it proved unsuccessful, resulting in her sentencing to be sent to hell. On December 23rd, 1890, at Newgate Prison, Mary Piercy faced execution by hanging, orchestrated by James Barry, just over a decade after her father, Thomas Wheeler, met a similar fate for a similar crime. I guess it kind of runs in the family. Number 1. Delphine LaLaurie. Delphine LaLaurie was a prominent New Orleans socialite who lived during the early 19th century. She's infamously remembered for her role in one of the city's most gruesome and horrifying scandals. Born Mary Delphine McCarty in 1787, LaLaurie married 3 times and became a central figure in New Orleans high society. However, her reputation took a pretty dark turn when her mistreatment of people that she kept forcibly endured came to light. Reports of extreme cruelty and sadistic practices circulated, revealing the disturbing treatment of servants within the LaLaurie mansion. In 1834, a fire at the mansion exposed a hidden chamber where individuals were discovered in appalling conditions, subjected to unimaginable horrors. The shocking revelation sparked public outrage, and Delphine LaLaurie fled the city, leaving behind a legacy of cruelty that continues to haunt the historical narrative of New Orleans.
But he did single-handedly disrupt century-old systems just to marry somebody else. And more than once at that. And it wasn't just the fact that he was marrying multiple wives, it's the fact that he wanted to divorce a wife for a new one, and some of these divorces were cut off one way compared to the other. In some way he was greedy, trying to create a nation under his standards by a male heir, but as greedy as one might be, he was also a hoarder. His urge to spend and purchase the best of everything drove England into debt. Reports suggest that he spent most of the kingdom's revenue hosting elaborated Christmas parties, as he was so fond of hosting parties that he renovated the kitchens of Hampton Court Palace. The renovated kitchen spread over 55 rooms with cooks who could prepare special meals. At the time of his death, he owned vast amounts of wealth, and the list of the wealth is as follows: 50 palaces, 6,500 hand weapons, 78 recorders, 70 ships, 78 flutes, a virginal, 5 sets of bagpipes, and 20,000 other items. When Henry inherited the throne, he also became the owner of money worth of £375 million. He also derived money from the dissolution of monasteries by imposing taxes on the people, and Henry, being a big spender, resulted him dying by debt as well. On his death, even though he was making bank, on the 20th of January 1547, he had accumulated 50 royal palaces as a mention of the record of the English monarchy, and spent the vast sums on those collections, including those musical instruments and tapestries. But not to mention gambling, as well as the millions he pumped into wars with Scotland and France. When Henry's son Edward VI took the throne, the royal coffers were in a sorry state. Henry was rather paranoid about illnesses and would go to great lengths to avoiding contracting the sweating sickness and the plague, which is something that his older brother did pass away from. He would frequently spend weeks in isolation and steered well clear of anyone he thought might have been the subject to disease, and this included his own wives. When he took his second wife, Anne Boleyn, caught in the sweating sickness in 1528, he stayed away from her until the illness had passed. Henry VIII was also known to self-medicate during his life, and even wrote his own prescription book which detailed how to treat ulcers and reduce inflammation. Joining a free tour in the British Museum, you can see Henry VIII's prescription book, for which he describes his own treatment of ulcers, reading an ointment devised by the King's Majesty made at Westminster, and devised a Greenwich to take away inflammations and to cease pain and heal ulcers, called Grey Plaster. Henry's less than complimentary nickname is a reference to the debasing of the coinage that took place during his reign in an effort to raise funds for ongoing wars against Scotland and France. Henry's Chancellor, Cardinal Wolsey, decided to add a cheaper metal to coins and thus mint more money at a lower cost. The increasingly thin layer of silver on coins would often wear off where the king's nose appeared, revealing the cheap copper beneath, hinting the name Copper Nose. Music was Henry's greatest passion, and he was not without musical talent. The king was a competent player of various keyboard, string, and wind instruments, and numerous accounts attested to the quality of his own composition. The Henry VIII manuscript contained 33 compositions traditions attributed to the king's the eighth, whatever it's called, and rumors have been long persisted that the traditional English folk song Green Sleeves was written by Henry for Anne Boleyn, but scholars have confidently ruled out this theory as Green Sleeves is based on an Italian style that only arrived in England long after Henry's death. But fun fact, Henry did have perfect pitch. Speaking from the bank, he'd spend on the people's taxes for meals and he ate a lot. Henry was 6'2" in height and weighed approximately 200 pounds when he became the king. However, as years went by, Henry indulged much more frequently and his weight went up to 320 pounds and his waist measured up to 54 inches. He consumed about 5,000 calories daily and Henry overweight to the extent that his body couldn't bear his weight anymore. A medical device was constructed to get Henry out of bed, and this device was assisted in getting him off his horse during the later years of his life. Henry became so obese as a result of not being able to exercise as much because of a bad jousting accident which reopened and worsened a previous injury he had incurred earlier in life. At the time of his death, he weighed 400 pounds, and the measurement for his final set of armor showed that his waist expanded up to 58 to 60 inches in the last years of his life. He developed several health complications as a result, and during his last days he developed ulcers on his legs which were constantly opened and infected. And speaking of Thanos, Wu Zetian also tried to do the same, but with her family bloodline. Emperor Wu's rise to power was achieved through cruelty and calculated tactics. A popular conspiracy theory stated that she killed her own baby girl and blamed it on Gaozong, an empress, so that the empress would be demoted. Even so driven with power that when her eldest son was the crown prince and became the crown prince, began to assert his authority and advocate policies, he suddenly died in 675, and many suspected he was poisoned by his own mother. His next heir and kin kept a low profile, or tried to, but then Empress Wu accused him of plotting of a rebellion and was later on banished, which was going to kick her in the butt later, as eventually a palace coup took place and forced Empress Wu to yield her position, and so the next day her son Zongzong was restored to the power and the Tang dynasty was formally restored. Still considered the golden era, the Tang dynasty thrived as a high point in Chinese civilization and a golden age of cosmopolitan culture, and with the trades and the land trades alongside the Silk Roads, maritime trades by sea, the Tang was able to acquire and gain many technologies and cultural practices and rare luxury items. And it was all thanks to the decision of getting rid of one power-obsessed empress. When it came to Queen Tamar of Georgia, or also known as Tamar the Great, she reigned from 1184 to 1213, as she is also known as the saint of the Georgian Orthodox Church, as she had appeared for her work in creating the Golden Age of Georgia. Together with her father, King George III, ruled the land until his death, and she ascended to the throne after defeating the nobles who dared to question the reign of a woman, and Tamar then killed all the clerics who questioned her and also replaced them with obscene lawyers that only aligned with her politically. She then married Russian Prince Yuri, who was an excellent military commander and helped her expand the Georgian territory, but unfortunately for Prince Yuri, he was not loyal. He was a big womanizer. Anytime he did excursions, he went off to expeditions, and the land wasn't the only thing he was expediting. So Tamar found out and she banished him for breaking her trust and her heart. I mean, he did what he was set out to do, but you know, these princes ain't loyal. Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman and alleged serial killer from the family of Bathory who owned the land in the Kingdom of Hungary. Bathory and 4 of her servants were accused of tormenting and killing hundreds of young and old women between 1590 and 1610. During her arrest, it is commonly believed that Bathory was caught in the act of torment and she was having dinner at the time. Most of the witnesses testified that they heard the accusations from others but did not see it themselves. The servants confessed under torment, which is not credible in contemporary proceedings. See, the accusations of killings were based on rumors, and several authors have argued that Elizabeth Bathory was a victim of conspiracy. Similarly, during the Salem witch trials, many people insisted that they saw accused witches of flying through the sky, and clearly neither things happened and are possibly formed of mass delusion or self-interest lies. Historians are therefore extremely careful in how they treat the eyewitness account of this sort of given possibility and collective in reinforcing the delusions of Elizabeth of Bathory. And when it came to Laura Bullion, also known as the Rose of the Wild Bunch, was a female outlaw who ruled the association with the Wild Bunch Gang, a notorious group of American outlaws led by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid during the late 19th and early 20th century. Laura Bullion was born in Knickerbocker, Texas in 1876, and her family moved to the mining town of Moab, Utah, where she grew up. Laura became acquainted with the members of the Wild Bunch, including Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and another bunch of notorious outlaws. She developed a romantic relationship with Kid Curry, a member of the gang, and Laura Bullion Bouillon participated in various criminal activities with the Wild Bunch, including train and bank robberies. She was known for her sharpshooting skills and her involvement with the gang's illegal enterprises, and in 1901, Laura was arrested in St. Louis, Missouri with her involvement with a train robbery. Although she ruled the Wild West with a pistol and a keen eye for targets, she eventually was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but she only served for 3. After her release from prison, Laura Bouillon decided to lead a more law-abiding life, where she lived in the assumed name in Memphis, Tennessee, working as a housekeeper. Laura Bouillon then passed away in December 2nd, 1961 in Memphis, Tennessee at the age of 85, and her death went largely unnoticed by the public. When it came to Empress of Julia of Agrippina, she was one for the list as one of the most terrible mothers, as unnecessary rulers who ruled under the guise of power by using their child. Yes, Empress Julia Agrippina of Rome regularly tried to overthrow her son. Agrippina the Younger was an ambitious person as far as the Roman rulers go, and she was once the first Roman empress. Although she spent much of her early years trying to dispose her predecessors, she truly believed that she and her son had the birthright claim to the empire, and manipulated her uncle Claudius into changing Roman laws about familial marriage so that the two could wed. Claudius' demise had been surrounded by mystery, and some sources claim Agrippina killed him. Together with her son Nero, she ruled Rome from 49 to 54 CE. Eventually, Nero grew tired of her manipulations and forced her out of power. She attempted to organize political opponents against her son, and he himself had her expelled. Jiang Qing, Lady of China, also known as the Mother of Communism, also known as the Madame Mao, the Chinese Communist revolutionary and actress and major political figure, was the 4th wife of Mao Zedong. She ruled as one of the architects and members of the Band of Four at the top of the Communist Party, and oversaw the destruction of China's ancient culture, art, literature, and agriculture. And although some might see that maybe some of their actions were misled, I'm talking about the villages and tribes spread out throughout China that didn't have a choice in associating with the communist regime. Mao's government had led to the famine and death of over 500,000 people, although it might be noted even more, and Jiang's was accused of fomenting the widespread civil unrest that had gripped China during the Cultural Revolution, but she refused to confess her guilt. Instead, she denounced the court and the country's leaders, and she received a suspended death sentence, but in 1983 it was commuted to life imprisonment. In the end though, at the age of 77, she took her own life in the bathroom of a hospital, leaving a note. Queen Isabella of the First of Spain is definitely on this list, as she was problematic like most of the one-minded sided individuals who have nothing better to do but to be exclusive and ignorant. And yes, I get she was a ruler of Spain that allowed the land to flourish in its riches and benefits, but who was it benefiting? Queen Isabella co-ruled Spain with King Ferdinand II from 1451 through 1504. During her reign, she marked by oppression. Called Isabella the Catholic, she and her husband instituted the Spanish Inquisition in 1478 to achieve religious unity by punishing non-Christians, doubters, and heretics. In 1492, the notorious Spanish Inquisition began her rule as she instrumented the efforts to expel Spanish Jews and Muslims from the kingdom. In 1492, the same year, she sponsored and led to Columbus' fateful journey as she decreed that all Jewish citizens either convert to Catholicism or be banished from the country. Jews from all around the country were brought to the Spanish court to either pledge their faith to the Catholic Church or be expelled on the spot. As for Columbus, as soon as he discovered the New World and immediately started slaying and enslaving people in Isabella's name, his expeditions to the New World directly led to the eradication of the Arawak people and the ends of millions of other native peoples around the world. It might be too clever to talk about Lizzie Borden as a pun, but I'll ask you guys about that later. Sorry. Anyways, Lizzie Borden was an American woman who was tried and then later acquitted for the axe murderers of her father and stepmother in Massachusetts. Lizzie was very religious and would go to church and do church activities, teaching Sunday school, etc., etc. 3 years later, after her mother passed away, her father remarried to Abby Gray. Lizzie didn't like Abby that much because she suspected Abby's goal was her father's money, and as tensions grew, even more when Andrew would gift real estate to his new family's wife and their stepmother received a house. The night before the murder, their uncle visited their father to discuss property transfer, which placed more tension. After the crime was committed, the police turned their attention to Lizzie as she gave conflicting testimonies within the day, and after many strange occurrences like her cleaning her dress and burning it up saying it was covered in paint, the town's suspicion of her drugging her father to sleep in order to whack him with an axe, overall the evidence was unclear and caused many controversial issues. However, the trial was later pushed away when another axe murderer similar to her father and her stepmom's case occurred 5 days prior. Still, the reputation of Lizzie and her sister's involvement was tarnished, and the suspecting evidence and accounts of that day remains unsolved. Number 9. Elsa Koch. Elsa Koch was a German war criminal who committed atrocities while her husband, Karl Otto Koch, was commanded at the Buchenwald in World War II. Because of the egregiousness of her alleged allegations, and her actions included that she had selected tattooed prisoners for death in order to fashionably create lampshades and other items from their skin. These are fake, by the way, they're not real. Her 1947 U.S. Military Commission Court trial at Dachau received worldwide media attention, as did the testimony of survivors who ascribed her sadistic and perverse acts of violence to cope, giving rise to her image as her concentration camp murderesses. However, authoritative testimony from numerous witnesses at her post-war trials firmly established that she had made extensive use of slave labor at the camp, had assaulted inmates on several occasions, and had reported inmates to the camp SS for beatings. Beatings that resulted in death on at least one occasion. While imprisoned, she experienced delusions and had become convinced that the concentration camp survivors would abuse her in the cell. She then ended up taking her own life in jail while serving time. Number 8. Belle Gunness. With an estimated 48 deaths at her hand, Belle Gunness poisoned, bludgeoned, and decapitated her victims, all so that she could collect and line her pockets with savings and insurance policies. This lonely hearts killer was known as Lady Bluebeard, amongst other names, luring her victims with newspaper advertisements. Gunness then began meeting wealthy men through a lovelorn column. Her suitors were her next victims, each of whom brought cash to her farm and then disappeared forever, including John Moo, Henry Galdhart, Olaf, Oli B, Andrew, just to name a few. One of the victims' brothers came suspicious, and Gunness's luck seems to be running out. Her farmhouse burnt to the ground, and the smoldering ruins workmen discovered 4 skeletons. 3 were identified as her foster young. However, the 4th, believed to be Gunness, was unexpectedly missing as its skull. After the fire, her victims were unearthed from their shallow graves around the farm. All told, the remains of more than 40 men and minors were exhumed. However, Belle managed to skip out of town before being officially convicted and was never tracked down. Her death has never been confirmed. Number 7. Countess Elizabeth Bathory. I don't know if you've seen the tales of Snow White and how there was this once evil queen who yearned for eternal beauty, but like all fairy tales come from the stem of truth. Countess Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman who was an alleged serial killer from the family Bathory, who owned a land in the Kingdom of Hungary. Bathory and 4 of her servants were accused of torturing and killing hundreds of young and old women between 1590 and 1610. During her arrest, it is commonly believed that Bathory was caught in the act of the torture, but the reality was that she was just having dinner. Most of the witnesses testified that she had heard the accusations from others, but did not actually see it themselves. The servants confessed under torture, which is not credible in contemporary proceedings. The accusations of the murder were based on rumors, and as there is no documents to prove that anyone in the area complained about the Countess, in this time period, if someone was harmed, or let's say someone stole something, a letter would be written out as a complaint. Several authors have argued that Elizabeth Bathory was a victim of conspiracy. Similar, during the Salem witch trials, many people insisted that they saw the accused witches of flying through the sky. Clearly neither thing happened and are possibly a form of mass delusion or self-interest lies. Historians are therefore extremely careful in how they treat eyewitness accounts of this sort, given the possibility for collective and self-reinforcing delusions. Henry VIII may have also written a theological treatise called Defense of the Seven Sacraments. This was written as a reply to Martin Luther, a criticism of the Catholic Church, and particularly to Lutherans and theology treatise Prelude on the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, which criticized some or all of the Catholic sacraments and attacked on the papacy. After all, Henry had a lot of beef with the Catholic Church. Henry was excommunicated from the Catholic Church in 1538. Excommunication means refusing to give someone communion and disallowing them from being involved with the Church. King Henry VIII authorized the Great Bible, the first authorized edition of the Bible in English, to be read aloud in church, and it was completed in 1538 and went through revisions between 1540 and 1541. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry VIII disbanded monasteries, as we know, had taxed the crap out of them, other Catholic religious houses, and appropriated their income. The monks who surrendered their rewards, while those few who resisted were executed, and Henry's last words were allegedly monks, 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 as this seems pretty strange as at face value, but it makes more sense when you consider the dissolution of the monasteries. No, I'm not talking about a specific body count when I say this, but which is pretty obvious of his outrageous relationships and the conquest of the male heir, even though throughout his rule he still kept this ruthless behavior, as Henry VIII ordered the death of roughly 72,000 of the English people through the capital punishment during his 38-year reign. Many of whom, including those monks earlier, were being members of the clergy or ordinary citizens and nobles who had taken part in uprisings and protests up and down the country. Victims of the king's reign were either executed by him or killed in his name. The category of the penalties were placed into 3 sanctions: heresy, treason, and denial of his royal supremacy as the head of the English Church. Of course, this is due to the fact of his other body count. Having to remarry multiple times was considered a big no-no, as the Vatican as a king could not have a queen if the previous was still living. But in the case instance of Catherine, his first wife, she was considered too old to bear any more kids, which is why he married Anne Boleyn. It was reasonable enough for him to break off from the church and make his own. Of course, the people loyal to the church did not approve of this, and had heavy criticisms of the king's decisions, as he would constantly marry, behead, and remarry every woman who came along, claiming they could birth him a son. Although scholars believe it could be roughly 52,000 to 72,000 people he could have executed during his reign, it still doesn't change the fact that you didn't know how to chill on the idea of Y chromosomes in your genome, or lack of, which is why he couldn't probably bear a son. Still, he was able to have one, as Edward was born. But still, it doesn't justify the killings of so many people. Either way, his bloodthirsty rampage, he was able to give England one of the greatest rulers of their time, Queen Elizabeth I. And fine, I'll talk about that body count. Yes, of course, when it came to Henry, we gotta talk about the one specific fact that everybody knows him on, was the fact that he couldn't keep to himself. Henry VIII's womanizing reputation has lasted throughout history thanks to his 6 infamous wives and mistresses. In spite of this reputation, we only know of 3 specific mistresses, one of being Anne Boleyn's sister, Mary. Because divorce wasn't allowed within the Roman Catholic Church, Henry wasn't allowed to divorce Catherine of Aragon and remarry Anne Boleyn. To get around this, Henry broke with the papacy in Rome and established a Church of England instead. There's a common belief that Henry married and discarded his 6 wives in quick succession, but that's not exactly true. He married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, when he came to throne at 17 because he passed away from sweating illness. He died. He married his brother's widow, who passed away from a very young age due to the sweating sickness that I mentioned earlier, and so Catherine of Aragon became his wife at the age of 17. Good guy, Henry, as they remained married for nearly 24 years. That is until their marriage annulled in order to get married to Anne Boleyn, as his shortest marriage was to Anne of Cleves, which lasted 6 months. She's buried in Westminster Abbey, and Henry VIII is said to have referred to Anne of Cleves as the Flanders mare, and a mare is a female horse, so I'm pretty sure this was not a compliment. In fact, he really hated her. Henry was laid to rest at St. George's Capitol in Windsor Castle next to Jane Seymour, Edward's mother, regarded by many as Henry's favorite wife, as Jane was the only one to receive a queen's funeral and birth him a son. 2 of his wives were executed. Catherine Howard was executed for adultery, and Anne Boleyn was accused of adultery, incest, and plotting to kill the king. Despite denying these charges, she was still executed. 5 men, including the queen's brother, were also executed for treasonous, adulterous, and having intimate relationship with the queen. And the evidence for all of this wasn't great, so we don't really know what happened that day. If anything, if they were all guilty of the crimes they were accused of, or if they were false charges, or Henry just needed to get rid of them. The groom of stool was a position in the royal household in charge of the cleaning, and you guessed it, yes, it's the king's backside. I know I mentioned this position many times before in this channel, but hey, that's something gross and you gotta know about it. Specifically, King Henry VIII, among many of his reforms, King Henry VIII introduced his job as he plucked one of the sons of the nobles' families to literally wipe his butt. And although this is a very odd and specific job for a male kin to do, there might have been a suspicion it was to teach a relative who he didn't like that I can make your offspring kiss my kiss my butt. Or maybe the reason he wanted to do so was because maybe family is the only people you can trust. However, those graced with this position would also be required to watch his diet, document them, and then be ready once those bowel movements cha-cha'd their way down. They didn't have baby wipes or baby powder, but they did have to make sure it was clean and dry. They also had to wipe down his buttocks with a sponge or a wet nurse, or just be a glorified butt washer. They were also responsible for helping him urinate and defecate by providing a wash basin, or for them just to use a regular old pot. And considering how unhygienic the medieval times were, I don't think they had latex gloves to protect themselves. This job was actually considered a very respectable job, as this was a direct intimate access to the king. He would live in the castle and earn a great salary, and this tradition King Henry VIII created would then be an ongoing career for the next 400 years. To be fair, this job is equivalent to many medical positions now, as they do, or at least they should pay them well, but at least that's what we should know when it comes to history.
Number 10, Mary I. So this is a ruler who could have reserved a place in common history as the first woman ever to be, the Queen of England. Instead, she is mostly remembered as Bloody Mary, a name she acquired because of her staunch and violent opposition to the Reformation. Look, the interwebs don't like the B word, so I had to spell it out, so I'm hoping you figured out what I was trying to say. The most controversial part of her reign was her religious policy. Despite promises a month into her rise to the throne that she would not pursue forced conversion of Protestants, Mary had leading Protestant churchmen imprisoned. She sought to reaffirm papal jurisdiction over England, and when the deal with Rome succeeded, the Heresy Acts were reinstated, which allowed for the burning of heretics. This sent a wave of fear through England, and around 800 Protestant nobles immediately fled the country. I wonder why. In February of 1555, the executions began. Protestant Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was forced to watch the bishops Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer being burned at the stake. Cranmer repented his Protestant faith, and technically, under law, he should have been absolved as a repentant, but Mary refused to accept his absolution and had him burned at the stake as well, just, set an example. or for funsies. By the end of her terror, Mary had almost 300 people executed, most of them by burning at the stake simply for the crime of being Protestant. Her reign was relatively short, lasting a little over 5 years, since she passed in 1558 from either ovarian cysts or ovarian cancer and was succeeded by Elizabeth I. Number 9, Wu Zetian. Look, I know it's in the title of today that I'd be talking about evil queens, but I support all women's wrongs. And rulers in other countries tend to have different titles to their equivalent of queens. So Wu was born to a relatively wealthy family and had extremely progressive parents, becoming well versed in a wide range of subjects including writing, music, literature, and perhaps most importantly, politics and governmental affairs. By the age of 14, Wu was summoned to the imperial palace to become a concubine of Emperor Taizong. After his passing, the newly anointed Emperor Li Zi, the youngest son of the late emperor, who became Emperor Gaozong, brought Wu to the imperial court to be his own concubine. I'm not going to unpack that. In 654, Wu bore a daughter, but shortly after the birth, it passed, with evidence showing strangulation. So Wu accused Empress Wang of the death, and Wang lost favor with the emperor. The most popular theory is that Wu actually did the act to her own daughter. So thereafter, the emperor conferred with his chancellors and, despite opposition, demoted Wang, having her imprisoned, and promoted Wu to empress. Later on, the emperor considered having Wang released, but Wu had her executed upon hearing this, because, can't have any witnesses. Upon her accession to the throne, Wu began targeting officials who had opposed her rise to power, having them arrested and imprisoned, exiled, forced to take their own lives, or executed. In 664, she accused several officials of witchcraft and had them executed as well, and their families became slaves within the imperial palace. In another incident, she killed her niece with poison, accused 2 others of the death, and executed them. She eventually passed after repeated bouts with illness, so nothing nefarious there. Number 8, Isabella of Castile. So when Isabella was born on the 22nd of April in 1451, there was little chance she would ever become monarch of Castile, as she was very far removed from the direct royal lineage. War, politics, and subterfuge intervened, however, and for many years, the Kingdom of Spain was in turmoil, suffering from civil wars and a lot of chaos. To quell one of the rebellions, the hand of Isabella was promised to the commoner, Pedro Duran Acuna Pacheco, but on his way to her, he suddenly fell ill and, passed. Now, this immensely fortuitous event for Isabella cemented her devotion to her faith, since she didn't exactly want to marry a commoner and prayed for divine intervention. Her marriage to Ferdinand, heir to the thrones of Castile and Aragon, cemented her future power. After the death of the King of Castile, the throne was given to Isabella. Her cruelty is recognized in the treatment of non-Christians, which led to the formation of the Spanish Inquisition, known for its extreme brutality and torture of mostly Jewish and Muslim folks. Isabella waged war on the Kingdom of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, and the last piece to fall in the Spanish Reconquista. While some may see it as the liberation of Spain, for many others it was open genocide. By the time Granada was annexed, 100,000 Muslims were either dead or enslaved. Number 7, Catherine de' Medici. I'm chuckling, but I'm glad my obsession with rain in high school is about to come in handy. So serving as the Queen of France from 1547 to 1559, Catherine had enormous political sway over her sons, the French kings Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. They reigned through the French Wars of Religion and faced problems with a group of Calvinist Protestants called the Huguenots. It is widely believed by historians that Catherine attempted to have their leader, Gaspard II de Coligny, assassinated. The attempt failed, and fearing retaliation from the most powerful folks in power, Catherine planned to kill them all before they could take action. The result was the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, which resulted in the deaths of between, 5,000 to 30,000 Huguenots.
Number 6, Dorothea Helen Puente. Dorothea Helen Puente was an American convicted serial killer, and in the 1980s she ran a boarding house in Sacramento, California, and murdered various elderly and mentally disabled boarders before cashing their social security checks. She paid each of them monthly spendies, but then kept the remaining for what she claimed were expenses for the boarding house. Puente's boarding house was visited by several parole agents as a result of previous orders for her to stay away from the elderly people and not to handle government checks. Despite these frequent visits, she was never charged with anything. Neighbors began to grow suspicious of Puente when she said that she adopted a homeless man named Chief to serve as a handyman. She had Chief dig the basement and remove soil and garbage from the property, and Chief then put in a newly concrete slab in the basement before he too mysteriously disappeared. In November 1988, another tenant in Puente's house, Alvaro Montoya, disappeared, and after he failed to show up for his meetings, his social worker reported him missing. Police arrived at Puente's boarding house and began to search the property. They discovered recently disturbed soil and were able to uncover 7 bodies in the yard. When the investigation investigation began, Puente was not considered a suspect, and as soon as the police let her out of their sight, she basically fled to Los Angeles, where she visited a bar and began to talk to an elderly pensioner. The man recognized her from the news, and then he called the police, and she was charged with 9 counts of murder and was sentenced to 2 years of life. She died at the age of 82 and had always insisted all of her tenants died to natural death. Number 5, Julia Tofana. Not your typical Chanel number 5, but this too was a femme fatale bottle used by so many women to do one major thing, to get rid of their husbands. By some definitions, Julia was a girl's girl. After all, it was the 1600s, and women who had malignant husbands who would physically harm and control them was a rather common issue, and the general rule was that unless your spouse passed away, that was the only time a woman could be granted her freedom. In its creation was associated by none other than Julia Tofana, who apparently was the ringleader of 6 poisoners in Rome. In order to avoid detection from authorities, they actually used the trade name after St. Nicholas and would sell the poison openly as a cosmetic. They even went ahead and used an image of St. Nicholas over the vials, and St. Nicholas and the vial of poison would be sold, affecting over 600 victims, mostly husbands. The active contents inside the vial was unknown, but it was filled with arsenic, lead, and possibly belladonna. It was colorless, tasteless, and therefore very easy to mix with other substances like wine or water. The poisoning would go unnoticed, and its symptoms would mimic other illnesses that was prominent at the time. First dosage would mimic a cold, the third would be digestive issues, and the fourth was death. It was so effective and helpful that when the poison was used to be in its slow active state, it would give the victims time to assume that they were dying and write a will. And if the provider of the poison changed their mind, an antidote was simply lemon juice and vinegar. Fun fact, Mozart at one point was poisoned using aqua tofana, but apparently he himself started this rumor. And if you knew anything about Mozart, he was the Bugs Bunny level type of troll. Number 4, Bonnie Nettles. As cult leaders go, most women of cult leaders were subject to follow their male counterparts. As for Bonnie Nettles, she was the co-founder and co-leader with Marshall Applewhite of the Heaven's Gate New Religious Movement. Although she was registered as a nurse and was married to a businessman named Joseph Nettles, she actually lived a relatively normal life. However, according to the New York Times, she began attempting to contact deceased spirits by conducting regular seances and came to believe that the 19th century monk named Brother Francis frequently spoke with her and gave her instructions. She also visited multiple fortune tellers who told her that she would soon meet a mysterious man who was tall with light hair and fair complexion, descriptions that were very close to Marshall Applewhite's appearance. It was unclear how they met, but after Nettles did an astrological reading for Applewhite, they had an instant spiritual connection. Nettles and Applewhite established Heaven's Gate together as equals, with Nettles running the group and Applewhite speaking for her. Nettles claimed to have communicated with aliens about the next level and told Applewhite to tell their followers. When Nettles died from cancer, the mass followers of Heaven's Gates would then follow through by cultivating to take their own lives in 1997. Number 3, Eileen Wuornos. On a bit recent note, you may or may not have heard in this case in the news, but Eileen Wuornos was a convicted serial killer as she targeted only men as an adult worker. She had up to 7 victims and would target specifically motorists, men who she would meet as a hitchhiker. Her story begins when her mother at the age of 14 married her father at the age of 19. After 2 months of having Eileen, her parents divorced and left her with her alcoholic grandparents who were also malicious in their care. Eileen would then do adult work as a minor once her grandfather kicked her out to live in the woods at the age of 15, and she tried to take her own life multiple times, all failed attempts, and until she met the love of her life, Tyra Moore, in the late 80s is when she would continue a string of crime. While she was incarcerated at the Florida Department of Corrections BCI death row for women, she tried to appeal to the US Supreme Court, which was later denied, and at that point she dismissed her legal counsel and terminated all pending appeals. She would then go off and say, "I killed those men, I robbed them cold as ice, and I'd do it again too. There's no chance in keeping me alive or anything, because I'd kill again. I have hate crawling through my system. I'm so sick of this she's crazy stuff. I've been evaluated so many times. I'm competent, sane, and I'm trying to tell the truth. I'm one who seriously hates human life and would kill again." After extreme mistreatments she suffered while imprisoned and the inhumane management given to her by her officers, in her final interview she turned to the interviewer and said, and also paraphrasing due to censorship, "You sabotaged me, society, and the cops and the system. An attacked woman got executed and was used for books and movies and so on." Her final on-camera words were, "Thanks a lot, society, for railroading my ass." She was later executed by lethal injection. Number 2, Pearl Fernandez. Again, although this case is one of a very recent event, it still marks as a notable case in the issues that lie in the legal forms, in the protections of minors, and the lack of involvement of CPS. Pearl Fernandez, you may or may not know, was the mother of Gabriel Fernandez, who passed away in Pearl and her boyfriend Usaro's custody. According to The Atlantic, Pearl Fernandez and her boyfriend shot Gabriel with a BB gun, tortured him with pepper spray, beat him with a baseball bat, and forced him to eat cat feces. All injuries pointed to severe psychological and emotional distress endured over a long period of time. It was not one-time event that led to Gabriel's death, it was months of torture. A judge rejected her remorse, stating that Pearl's actions were horrendous and inhumane and nothing short of evil. At her trial, jurors heard how Gabriel was tortured and abused by his mother and her boyfriend after being placed in their care 8 months before his death. Pearl is now serving time at the Central California Women's Facility after being sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Number 1. Jolly Jane. While she definitely was jolly when she committed these crimes, Jane Toppin, nicknamed Jolly Jane, was an American serial killer who was known to have committed 12 murders in Massachusetts between 1895 and 1901. How did she commit these? Well, she was a nurse, and her objective was oddly enough to target patients and their family members. Doctors who hired her thought of her as one of their best nurses, but today psychiatrists say that she was one of the most unusual serial killers in history. She was born and raised in the Boston Female Asylum, where unwanted female children were often abandoned. There she was adopted by Ann Toppin, where she was under foster care until she was 18. At this point, she then pursued nursing at Cambridge Hospital in Boston. It was here where she stated her interest in the patients was ought to be taken care of. She grew emotional attachments to them, and if she really liked them, she would fake their medical documents to force them to stay longer at the hospital. She would then also dose her elderly patients with opium to see how they react with the drugs, and then upping the dosage each time. She would also watch them slowly succumb to their death, and she would also mix different types of poisons with her patients and other drugs to stage a sickness and nurse them back to health. Very similar to the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case, where her mother Dee Dee had a mental illness known as Munch-Austin syndrome by proxy. This mental health condition is basically where a caregiver makes up or causes an illness or injury in a person under their care, such as the young or the elderly adult, or a person who has a disability. Because vulnerable people are the victims, MSBP is a form of multiple harm cases. Jolly Jane also had a masochistic side, as she would even get into the bed of her patients who were suffering until they died. She wasn't caught until she used a metallic-based poison on a victim, which finally sparked an investigation. In a court in 1902, Toppin was found guilty, and then she told her attorney that she actually killed more than 100 people and even got in beds with more of her victims. She was sentenced to stay at an asylum, stayed there until her death.
Number 10, the oldest profession in history. Alrighty folks, we're kicking off today with a nice dose of internet no words, so bear with me here. If I sound convoluted, you know why. The Middle Ages in Europe witnessed a universal paradox of tolerance and condemnation with regards to the selling of one's body services. While technically a sin because it hinged on the act of fornication, this act was recognized by the church and others as necessary, or a lesser evil. It was accepted as fact that young men would seek out sexual relations regardless of their options, and thus this profession served to protect respectable townswomen from seduction or worse. In 1358, the Grand Council of Venice declared that this field was absolutely indispensable to the world. In general, declarations proclaiming the necessity of this line of work were not quite so enthusiastic. The church didn't hesitate to denounce it as morally wrong, but as St. Augustine explained, if you expel it from society, you will unsettle everything on account of lusts. So, you gotta have it. It just wasn't exactly ideal back then. Number 9. Hunting witches. Witch hunters often had their suspects stripped and publicly examined for signs of an unsightly blemish that witches were said to receive upon making their pact with Satan. Now this devil's mark could supposedly change shape and color, and was believed to be numb and insensitive to pain. And more often than not, women were both the witches and the witch hunters. And in these cases, it was easy for even the most minor physical imperfections to be labeled as the work of the devil himself. Moles, scars, birthmarks, sores, and tattoos could all qualify, so examiners rarely came up empty-handed. If found guilty, witches would be sent through a series of trials and punishments, starting with the scold bridle. Also known as a witch's bridle, a gossip's bridle, a brink's bridle, or simply brinks, this was an instrument of public humiliation. It was an iron muzzle in an iron framework that enclosed the head. Some exceptions were masks that depicted suffering, but not pleasant either way. Oh, you want me to elaborate? Alrighty folks. A bridle bit or cur plate around 5 centimeters by 2.5 centimeters in size was slid into the mouth and pressed down on the top of the tongue, often with a spike on the tongue as a compress. Ouchie. It functioned to silence the wearer from speaking entirely and cause extreme pain and physiological trauma to scare and intimidate the wearer into submission. Now this prevented speaking and resulted in many unpleasant side effects for the wearer, including excessive salivation and fatigue in the mouth. Seeing how I've always been a chatty Cathy, I would have been sentenced to this, and my jaw hurts thinking about it. The wearer was then led around the town by a leash, and for extra humiliation, a bell could also be attached to drawing crowds. It was used as corporal punishment for other offenses, notably on female workhouse inmates, and the person to be punished was placed in a public place for additional humiliation, and who knows what else. I'm sure you can put 2 and 2 together. There's things I cannot say. Number 8. Bathing in what now? Aptly named the Blood Countess, Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman and was one of the most prolific female serial killers of her time. At the end of the 16th century and beginning of the 17th 17th, she tormented and killed up to 650 young women at her castle in is what now known as Slovakia. The macabre nickname came from her apparent tendency to bathe in the redness of her victims, as she believed it would help her maintain her youthful looking skin. I'll stick to my Epsom salts and the occasional bath fizzy. Oh, and my cleansing routines. Look, I swear my one cleanser from The Ordinary might look suspicious, but it's not human redness. I just play a vampire professionally, folks, I'm not an actual one. Or maybe. Number 7. Serfdom. In most Middle Ages communities, the king technically owned all the land in an area. He would lease it out to noble barons in exchange for an oath of their loyalty, and then these nobles had the freedom to govern their land and impose taxes as they pleased. Yeah, as you can expect, they were pretty brutal about it. This privilege for the few landed barons came at a great cost to the serfs. Now this was the poor mass of people who had no land and no rights. They were essentially treated as slaves by the local nobles, and they toiled on the land and brutally worked 6 days a week from dawn until dusk. Per the feudal system, they were forced to produce crops, raise livestock, and offer some value, to pay their liege lord for the use of the land. And the grind never ended. If you were born into the lower class, it was extremely likely you would remain there for your entire life. There was no social mobility or opportunity to work through one's birth position. Instead, the poor, unwashed masses simply kept working hard and toiling away with no chance of ever improving their lives. If that's not evil, I don't know what is. Number 6. Lady Elizabeth Bathory. Born in 1560 on a family estate in Royal Hungary, Elizabeth was of noble lineage and privileged with education, wealth, and a lofty social rank. Her first taste of the morbidly bizarre was introduced to her during the early years of her life when she suffered seizures which might have been epilepsy. Treatment at the time for such bouts included feeding the patient human redness and bits of skull from a non-sufferer. She bore witness to brutal punishments and executions carried out by her father's officers and was influenced by family members involved with Satanism and witchcraft. When she was barely in the double digits of age, Elizabeth was engaged to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, who she later married. Her husband spent much of his time away from home fighting the Ottomans, leaving Elizabeth to run the estate. Her sadism became more pronounced as time wore on, and upon the death of her husband in 1601, her vicious crimes escalated. Most of her victims were girls around the age of the time she got married, and were usually the daughters of lesser gentry who had been sent to court to learn etiquette. Her favorite punishment methods including using pins to stick under her victims' fingernails and covering her victims in honey and leaving them out to be eaten by ants and other insects. Other methods included whipping her victims with nettles and frequently burning body parts, especially genitalia. After burning her victims, she would dump them in icy water. Many of them were punished to the point of death, some of whom were buried in unmarked locations, and some sources even claim she engaged in people munching, making that her darkest secret. Elizabeth and a few of her servants were eventually arrested in 1610, and her accomplices were put on trial in 1611. With over 300 witness accounts and numerous testimonials, a guilty verdict was assured. A servant girl who claims to have seen evidence in Elizabeth's private books stated that her victims were around 650 folks. The accomplices were sentenced to death, and Elizabeth was confined to a bricked-up room with slits for air and delivery of food. She was found dead a couple years later. Number 5. Marie Antoinette. So France's queen between 1774 and 1792 was Marie Antoinette, who was, the last queen before the French Revolution. She had quite the reputation for splurging on expensive things and found herself in quite a few scandals. One in particular was the affair of the diamond necklace. So Countess de la Motte, a young lady, pretended to be the queen's friend and entered the French court in 1785. She fooled a high society member into believing that Antoinette loved him. She even hired a body-selling worker and disguised her as the queen and convinced the man that Marie wanted to purchase a diamond necklace. The jewelry cost around 1,600,000 livres then, which is almost $12 million today. The money was never paid, and the queen had no clue about what had taken place. But even though she was innocent, the public still despised her. Granted, she's mostly known for her infamous dialogue. When French subjects could not afford bread, she said, "Let them eat cake," which fueled the French Revolution and ultimately led to her execution. Number 4. Queen of Castile. So Juana la Loca was the Queen of Castile from 1504 to 1516, and she suffered from various mental disorders. After her husband passed in 1506, her father buried his body. However, Juana used to open the tomb and caress her husband's dead body, and ultimately she ordered the body dug out and kissed her husband's feet. Additionally, she would carry his coffin everywhere with her, and actually kept it under her bed. Years later though, she eventually allowed his burial outside her window. Look, I just keep weird dolls under my bed. Number 3. Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg. Maria Eleonora, born on November 11th of 1599, passing eventually on March 28th of 1655, held the title of Queen of Sweden from 1620 to 1632 as the wife of King Gustav II Adolf. Coming from a noble German family, she belonged to the prestigious house of I'm not even going to try and say that. However, when Maria and Gustav gave birth to a girl with a genetic condition causing excessive hair growth, Maria was deeply shocked. The unexpected appearance of her daughter, combined with societal beauty expectations, pushed Maria to her limits. She considered her daughter ugly and refused to care for what she perceived as a monstrous creature. When Gustav died when Christina was only, this many years old, Maria blamed her for his death. For over a year, Maria subjected Christina to very harsh punishment, confining her to blacked out, darkened rooms to mourn her father in solitude for very extended periods, even placing her father's open casket in Christina's room and demanding she sleep next to it, which that's way too morbid, even by my standards. Maria's mental state deteriorated, eventually leading to Christina's removal from her custody. So thank goodness for Christina. Number 2 is Sixty the Dragon Lady. So the story of her rise to power is a remarkable one. Born at a time when Chinese women were politically invisible, this lady managed to acquire enormous political influence by exploiting her position as a royal concubine, engaging in court intrigues and manipulating those around her. By the end of the 1860s, she had become the most powerful individual in China. Her will and her reach even exceeded 2 male emperors, who she frequently bypassed or overruled. Now, she was originally born Lan Kuo in 1835, the daughter of a minor Manchu official, and at age 15 she was selected as a potential concubine for the emperor and relocated to the Forbidden City. She was elevated to the status of concubine officially by age 18, eventually giving birth to the emperor's only son, Zechun, a feat that earned her another promotion in the palace hierarchy. The emperor died in 1861, and shortly after the disastrous Second Opium War, left the throne to his only son. So as the mother of the reigning emperor, Cixi was given the courtesy title Dowager Empress. So by this point, the empress had become quite adept at manipulation, palace intrigues, and power games. Through forged evidence and false testimony, she engineered the arrest of the 8 ministers, 3 of whom were later executed. With the regency council gone, the empress became the de facto regent for the duration of her son's reign, until his early death from smallpox in 1875. The empress was instrumental in the succession, choosing her young nephew Zetian, who was crowned as emperor. So once again, this Dowager Empress acted as regent to the infant emperor, this time in a more formal capacity. 12 years into the young emperor's reign, our empress moved to the summer palace in Beijing, and surrounded by a network of informants and advisors, doted on by loyalists and conservatives in the bureaucracy and military, she continued to exert enormous influence on appointments, policies, and matters of state. Stories of the empress's extravagance are prevalent, since it has been claimed that she regularly increased her personal and food allowances, that she withdrew gold and silver from dwindling national reserves, and spirited millions of pounds offshore into bank accounts in London. Other tales of her exorbitant spending include her decision to spend 10 million silver taels, some set aside to rebuild the Chinese Navy, on the renovation of one of her palaces. Another rumor claims that 3,000 ebony boxes were needed to restore her jewelry collection. Number 1, Agrippina the Younger. So Julia Agrippina, also referred to as Agrippina the Younger, was a Roman empress from 49 to 54 AD, the 4th wife and niece of Emperor Claudius and the mother of Nero. After the death of her first husband, Agrippina tried to make shameless advances to the future emperor Galba, who showed no interest in her and was devoted to his wife. On one occasion, Galba's mother-in-law gave Agrippina a public reprimand and a slap in the face before a whole bevy of married women. She was one of the most prominent women in the Julio-Claudian dynasty, functioning as a behind-the-scenes advisor in the affairs of the Roman state via, the powerful political ties. She maneuvered her son Nero into the line of succession, and Claudius became aware of her plotting, but died in 54, and it was rumored that Agrippina poisoned him. She exerted a commanding influence in the early years of Nero's reign, but in 59 she was killed. Both ancient and modern sources describe Agrippina's personality as ruthless, ambitious, violent, and domineering.
Number 10, Ted Kaczynski. As a young man, Kaczynski was a mathematic prodigy, and at Harvard University he underwent psychological experimentation designed to harm and humiliate subjects, which may have been part of the CIA's mind control program, aka MK Ultra, as he began to have a promising career at UC Berkeley, then suddenly resigned and retreated to the wilderness, determined to fight industrialization and the destruction of nature. Between 1978 and 1995, he mailed and delivered explosives to targets of tertiary institutions and aviation companies across the country, killing at least 3 people and injuring 23. The FBI dubbed him the University and Airline Bomber, leading to the nickname the Unabomber. A manhunt finally caught Kaczynski in 1996, after which he was given 8 life sentences. Number 9, Henry Kissinger. Considering he was a very notable figure in American politics, his choices in regards to political American policies involving foreign affairs warfares were extremely costly and disregarding of human life. When the Vietnam War exploded in 1955 and lasted till 1975, it had been noted that it was America's longest and most expensive war that had occurred in that era. At this time, there had been at least 4 noted US presidents, and Henry Kissinger acted as the Secretary of State for both Nixon and Ford. In regards to the conflicts between the North and the South Vietnam over the control of which mega empire would rule, this side more in Asia, whether the USSR in the North, Americans in the South, that backing that could have technically liberated the South Vietnamese was costly, as it was noted to be up to another potential $700 million. But Kissinger, despite him stating in reports he wished Congress approved his call to liberate the South Vietnamese, he happened to also make deals behind closed doors with their leaders, sacrificing them for the US POWs held hostage in the North. But also considering it was expensive and they needed oil, the Middle East were having conflicts after the Nakba that occurred in Palestine, how the colony Israel had taken over lands, and in order for the US to get oil, Kissinger had to write to Israel to release some of the land so that they colonized back to the Arab nations so that the US could get oil to continue their war in Vietnam. But the sympathy towards the South Vietnamese dwindled, not just economically but socially, when people went into the streets yelling for the government to stop funding this war, killing civilians, not just the American young men forced into the war and developing PTSD later, but the hundreds of thousands of innocent Vietnamese that had also died. Kissinger had the gall to also say to President Ford in a quote, "If you do that, the American people will go in the streets again," and referring to the Vietnamese, "Why don't those people die faster? The worst thing they can do is linger on." Yeah, he said that. As a result, the $700 million that could have liberated the South Vietnamese mysteriously was rejected by 76 congressmen into the Senate and went towards the colony Israel instead. As well as in regards to the Bangladesh Liberation War, Kissinger sneered at the people who bled for the dying Bengalis and even called Indians bastards. Nice guy. Number 8, Harvey Weinstein. For sure, this guy is pretty new for the history books, but he will for sure be mentioned in law books in regarding to blackmailing, coercion, and so much more messed up stuff like physically harming and harassing women and threatening their career. As a former Hollywood film producer, he became the center of a high-profile criminal case that brought attention to issues of harassment and physical harm in the entertainment industry. The allegations against Weinstein were a catalyst for the Me Too movement, a social media campaign encouraging survivors of harassment and harm to come forward with their experiences. The movement shed light on the widespread issues of misconduct in various industries. Weinstein faced a high-profile trial in New York in early 2020, and the trial included testimony from multiple women who accused him of misconduct. On February 24, 2020, Weinstein was then convicted of physical non-consensual harm in the 3rd degree and criminal act in the 1st degree. He was then acquitted for more serious charges, including predatory harm. Number 7, Ed Gein. Ed Gein, also known as the Butcher of Plainfield or the Plainfield Gowl, was an American killer and body snatcher who gained infamy for his gruesome crimes in the 1950s. His activities served as a partial inspiration for various fictional serial killers in books and films. Gein's crime was discovered in 1957 when police investigated the disappearance of a hardware store owner, Bernice Warden. During a search of Gein's property, they found Warden's decapitated body hanging in Gein's shed, dressed out like a deer. Dressed, like skinned. Further investigation revealed a house of horrors, as Gein was a grave robber who exhumed corpses from local cemeteries. He admitted to creating a variety of items from human body parts, including clothing, furniture, and masks. Gein's gruesome artifacts shocked the public so much and fueled sensationalized media coverage, and Gein was suspected in the disappearances of 2 other individuals, but only 2 deaths were definitely linked to him, Bernice Warden and his own brother, Henry Gein. Ed Gein was declared mentally unfit for trial and spent the rest of his life in psychiatric institutions. He was then diagnosed with schizophrenia, and his confinement included time in the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane in Waupun, Wisconsin, later in a mental health institution. He was kind of inspired for that chainsaw massacre thing as well.
Number 6, getting married way too young. Yeah, medieval females obtained the status of married woman very early. At the age of a girl reached the age of majority and was entitled to marry. Now, in this scheme of things, the choice of her future husband was based entirely on her parents' will. No wonder a marriage sanctioned by the law of the church turned out to be a nightmare for many wives. Under civil law, a husband was permitted to moderately physically harm his wife. Actually, a medieval tradition advised a husband to treat his wife as a pupil. So, like, teach her place. So a lot of desperate women, therefore, killed their husbands. The legislation of those times had detailed regulations governing punishment for women who had killed their husbands. They were sentenced to death by burning alive or burning at the stake. Kinda like a witch. Creative, but not really. Number 5, have more than 10 offspring. Yes, I know this can be a touchy subject, so just bear with me here. I'm not calling giving birth evil by any means, or having multiple offspring by choice evil. I more mean that back in the day, it was a woman's job to essentially reproduce as many offspring as possible to help around the home and to continue on the family name. As somebody who has zero interest in ever reproducing, and that is my personal choice, I have many friends who have, and I will be a fantastic aunt. The thought of giving birth once is terrifying, never mind that often. I read about a lady who had 17 offspring, and sure, while some of those might have been multiple births, I can't even imagine the pain. Or also just raising that many little ones, being responsible for that many little ones. The stress, no thank you. All the props to them, but evil because they were forced to, not because they wanted to. Number 4, take up the waste. After that last one, let's start this point with a fun fact, shall we? So the British word for toilet, loo, derives from the French gardez l'eau, meaning, watch out for the water. Gardez l'eau, je parle français. This comes from the fact that, well, in medieval Europe, people simply threw the contents of their chamber pots out of the window onto the streets. Now before throwing the waste out of the window, they'd yell, gardez l'eau. The term gardez l'eau first came to English as gardy-loo, and then shortened to loo, which eventually came to mean the toilet itself. People in the Middle Ages were no less sensitive to foul odors or disgusted by human waste than we are. They also didn't understand exactly how human waste could spread disease, but they knew it, did, they just thought it was something to do with its odors. And hey, while we're on the topic of hygiene, in the early Middle Ages, women passionately cared about personal hygiene. Many townspeople took a bath, and there were a lot of bathhouses in towns. But due to the total victory of Christianity, life kind of changed. With all bathhouses being public, the church viewed it as a violation of moral standards. So then they closed them, and then untidiness was elevated to the level of virtue. Look, I'm a bit of a Christianity hater, so I'm just gonna leave that one be. Number 3, V-Day traditions. So during medieval times, they believed that if a young woman ate strange food on Valentine's Day, she'd dream of her future husband. And at a time where normal meals were delicacies such as a boar's head sewed onto a turkey's body, these weird meals were, well, extra weird. The roasted hedgehog was just one of the bizarre foods that these young women would enjoy in hopes of seeing visions of their future Valentines. Yeah, okay, because that's gonna make me gag, how about we do a little palate cleanser before we move on to the next bad thing? So other sayings that were popular at the time was if you saw a bluebird, you would marry a happy man. If you see a goldfinch, you're gonna marry a millionaire. And if you see a sparrow, you're marrying a poor man. If you find a glove on the road on Valentine's Day, your future beloved will have the other missing glove. Now by the 18th century, gift giving and exchanging handmade cards had become common practice. In England, handmade cards incorporating lace and ribbon became popular. And eventually this form of gift spread to the American colonies and into our traditions today. Also, it was found to be terrible luck to sign your name on a Valentine's Day card, and the superstition must have been very confusing for some folks, but convenient for others. As well as cards and flowers, the next gift to become popular was the giving of chocolates, and this can be traced back to Richard Cadbury, of yes, the famous chocolate making family, who invented the first Valentine's Day candy box. Now as those grew in popularity, chocolates started to be given in decorated boxes filled with, romantic imagery. I remember my first boyfriend got me a box back, way back when, it was a box of chocolates. I think my mom still has the box, because it was a really pretty box. Number 2, institutionalized. Okay folks, back to the icky stuff. Being sent away was a way to impose a pious life of no ownership or wealth, sexual relationships, any devotion to God, and administer healthcare and alms to the most unfortunate in society. In reality, it didn't always work. It was a way of kings, lords, and earls banishing troublesome wives, just to get them out of sight, out of mind. They could even do it to young that they didn't want to have around. Just a way of cleansing the soul, if you like. Hey look, if we're looking at the upside, a woman from aristocracy only had 2 options in life. Marry a man who could support you, or join a nunnery. Now, virginity was an integral requirement for a nun in the very early medieval period, because physical purity was considered the only starting point from which to reach spiritual purity. A nun was expected to wear simple clothing as a symbol of her shunning of worldly goods and distractions. The long tunic was typical attire, with a veil to cover all but the face as a symbol of her role as a bride of Christ. The veil also hid her hair, which had to be kept cut short. Nuns could not leave their nunnery in contact with outside visitors, especially men. That was kept to an absolute minimum. No temptation here. Granted, life isn't perfect. There was a couple of little scandals. I know there's one in mid-12th century, where at the Gilbertine Wotton Abbey in England, a lay brother had a sexual relationship with a nun, and on discovery of the sin, was castrated. It's kind of a common punishment of the period for that type of crime. Can we bring it back? Not for cheating, but for bad things. Number 1, take care of the monthly visitor. As someone who's currently dealing with my regular monthly episode of cramping and being a miserable witch, how women had to deal with this in history before modern products is very much evil in my book. So it was very much a vastly different experience than it is today. To start, medieval women had fewer periods than today's women. Poor nutrition and hard work meant that they had very low body fat, and a woman needs to have some sort of it, or her reproductive system slows down and menstruation ceases. In our modern words, for example, medieval women could use a makeshift, pad or tampon. Pads are made of scrap fabric or rags, hence that's where the phrase came from. Cotton was preferred though, because the material absorbs fluids better than the alternative, which was wool, which is also itchy and uncomfortable. There is some archaeological evidence to show us that some women may have worn panty-like garments, and they could also wind cotton fabric around a twig, and you make of that what you will. Interesting side note though, a common type of bog moss found throughout medieval England. Now the long official name I can't say, but the popular name was blood moss, and people realized that they could use it in the battlefield as first aid. So, put 2 and 2 together. Also, the main reason why medieval petticoats came in red, it was fashionable, decorative, but it was good at disguising accidents.
Maximilian Robespierre. It is pretty well known conception when it comes to the French. Riots, protests, and petitions and revolutions are pretty coherent. Every time the citizens of France are pissed off about something, you can guarantee they'll be on the streets and ready to go. But when did this start? Well, in 1789, when King Louis XVI needed more money, he failed to raise taxes, and when he called a meeting with the State General, a man named Maximilien Robespierre came about after he was inspired to become a political advocate for the revolutionary cause. Especially since the fact that he defended the will of the people with such conviction that he was nicknamed the Incorruptible at the time. But as always, when it comes to political leaders, that title can only last for so long. Because the idea and title of being such a sudden spokesperson for the people entered his head, he concluded that those who opposed him also meant opposing the people, which again wasn't true. Just because you're a spokesperson for the people doesn't mean you represent all the people. As political leaders and representatives, your role is to listen to the people even if individually they criticize you. You still need to take into consideration for effective leadership. And although we can get into the deeper details, eventually after hundreds and thousands of people died, and successes of committees and policies, the Republic was still in danger as Maximilian commented on criminals disguising themselves as patriots. In summary, the use of the guillotine was used about 16,594 times, and in the end, victims of the massacres were noted as they were caught in the crossfires of the patriotic bloodshed. In the end, his quasi-dictatorship obsession came to the end when he himself, Maximilian, was also guillotined. Number 9. Beverly Elite. Like all ordinary people, it all starts with a specific moment in time where a switch is flipped and you no longer see yourself as the bad guy, or if there's a sense of self-awareness, maybe you do know but you just can't stop. In the cases of Beverly Elite, she was actually always into the idea of taking care of somebody, and when she was young she had the tendency to practice medical stuff, like play a nurse or do gauzes and cast. But it wasn't in a form of, oh I want to learn how to be a nurse, it was more so of like, hey I'm hurt, can you pay attention to me kind of thing. Even to the point the obsession and desperation of being paid attention to would lure her to causing inflictions onto herself and then convince her own doctor to even remove her healthy appendix. She then left school and at 16 took a course in nursing, as this was in 1968, so everyone was just doing things very early on. And as soon as she finished her course, however, she got into a hospital, and in 6 months of hell, specifically over a period of 59 days, she would harm and kill over a dozen children. Every child under her care would suffer from cardiac arrest, chest pains, life support, and insulin overdose. The sad part was, because she was a pediatric nurse, people trusted her fully with their children, thinking she was taking care of their kids, but after staff grew skeptic of another child's death, that's when they found out she had access to drugs and eventually led to her arrest. When she was being interviewed, she apparently laughed, smiled, smirking that she wouldn't go to jail, but justice prevails, and as on May 1993 she was sentenced to life in prison. Number 8. James Patterson Smith. When it comes to toxic relationships, this is an important note that there are sources out there when you don't know if you are in one, and as well as another note, if you feel like the person has to hurt you to love you, I'm going to tell you right now that is not what that is. Find people who care about you, and if it got physical, just call authorities. In the case of Kelly Ann Bates, she was unfortunately groomed by James Patterson Smith when she was just 14 years old. She was babysitting for friends, and Smith had an odd impact on Kelly, but what's more odd was that he was 45 years old. A 45-year-old man was hitting on a 14-year-old. And when Kelly tried to introduce him to her mom, she was livid, and she said, "Kelly, this man is bad and not a good man," and hair would actually rise at the back of her mom's neck. She was right. After 4 weeks straight, Kelly would be tormented, harmed, attacked, and be left with injuries so extensive that when they found her drowned body in the bathtub, authorities knew it was something they just haven't seen before, especially how her eyes were gouged out. Prosecutors noted that the trial had it in quote, "It was like Smith was trying to deliberately disfigure her, causing her the utmost pain, distress, and degradation." The injuries were not the result of sudden eruption of violence, but a torment that caused over time. They eventually noted that Smith was delusional and had a distorted reality with paranoia and morbid jealousy. It only took the jury only 1 hour to sentence the man to life. Number 7. Basil Zaharoff. When it comes to a good salesman, from what I've been told from friends who used to do door-to-door or did retail and the require of commissions, they always tell me that it's about human connection. And as for Basil Zaharoff, he was viewed as a master of bribery and corruption. Considered as the mystery man of Europe, you're looking at the most important people of the time when it comes to influencing the political scene in Europe with his arms deals. On both sides, he would actually sell weapons where he'd be dubbed Merchant of Death. He didn't care which side he was selling to, just as long as he was selling. After all, considering the current times, war is a business. Not even at the expense of civilians or human life as a whole. To men like Basil, they only care about money. Even today, despite his transactions, they remain a mystery as he took up 2 days burning as much evidence as possible. After the First World War, he wanted more money and focused on the conflicts in Greece, where he single-handedly convinced both parties between Venizelos and King Constantine to use his weapons against each other. He was basically playing Sims, but in real life. In the end, his life was shaped by seizing opportunity wherever he could find it, and through his self-serving businesses dealings, he helped shape the power dynamics of Europe and thus played an instrument part in the history of the continent. Number 6. Clementine Barnabette. Clementine Barnabette was an American woman who gained notoriety in the early 20th century for alleged involvement in a series of deaths in Louisiana. Barnabette claimed to be a member of a religious cult led by her father, Raymond Barnabette, and she asserted that the cult believed in cleansing the world by killing those that seemed sinful. Between 1911 and 1912, a series of brutal axe deaths occurred in Texas and Louisiana, and Barnabette confessed to being involved in some of these killings. In 1912, Clementine was arrested along with her father, two brothers, and the connections of these deaths. She confessed to her involvement in the crimes, claiming that she and her family were carrying out God's works, killing sinners. It was a job. Bernabette's confession came under scrutiny as some believed it might have been coerced or influenced by her father, but there were also doubts about the accuracy of her statements. And regarding the number of victims and her role in the killings, Clementine Barnabette then went to trial for her alleged involvement in the crime. In 1913, she was found guilty and sentenced to prison, and her father and brothers were also convicted, but more of a lengthy sentence. Clementine Barnabette spent the rest of her life in prison and was never released, thankfully. And the circumstance surrounding the crime remains controversial and still unsolved or unresolved. Number 5, Jeffrey Epstein. I know a lot of folks know this man as a greedy, nasty, rich jerk who lived in a vile organization, allowing other rich, nasty folk to take advantage of the young and vulnerable. But as the ringleader of a trafficking and harming of young women everywhere, apparently in 2008, Epstein pleaded guilty to state charges in Florida for soliciting and procuring a person under 18 for adult work, meaning under 18, young adolescents, like the age of 12 or 14. He then reached a plea deal that allowed him to avoid federal charges and served only 13 months in jail. This lenient deal, orchestrated by the then U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta, later then became a subject of public scrutiny, which as it should, considering why is the U.S. so lenient on crimes on young people, like people that the law should protect. And then finally, 10 years later, after who knows how much more damage and crime he's committed, in July 2019, federal prosecutors in New York arrested Epstein on trafficking charges. They accused him of exploiting and abusing dozens of underage girls, and the rest following the unsealing of a new indictment, but by then 2020, somehow he died in his cell. Some say he took his own life, and others, well, when it comes to controversy, that they didn't want him to talk. After all, the nature of his relationships and the extent of his activities fueled public outrage. He wasn't alone in this, after all, he needed someone else to lure these young underage individuals, so Ghislaine Maxwell, you know her, was also charged and arrested. Investigations into Epstein's activities and the circumstances surrounding the 2008 plea deal continued. Legal actions against his estate and those connected to him remain ongoing, reflecting the broader effort to seek justice for their victims. Number 4, Joseph James DeLangelo. Joseph James DeLangelo, also known as the Golden State Killer, is an American serial killer and caused this YouTube, because I gotta be very discreet, physically violated people, if you know what I mean, who terrorized California in the 1970s and 1980s. DeLangelo's crime was initially attributed to several monkeers, including East Area Harmer and original Night Stalker. Unlike Richard Ramirez, another serial killer and vile man, his crime initially began in the Sacramento area before spreading out to other parts of the state. DeLangelo's modus operandi included breaking into homes, often targeting couples. I guess he was just jealous. He would tie up and harm the victims, committing non-consensual harm and then theft. In later crimes, he escalated to killings, earning him the nickname the Golden State Killer. The case remained unsolved for decades, but advancement in DNA technology played a crucial role in solving it. In 2018, investigators used a public genealogy website to identify distant relatives of the suspect and eventually led them to Joseph James DeLangelo. DeLangelo was arrested on April 24, 2018 at his home in Citrus Heights, California, and he was identified through DNA evidence and genealogical research. At the time of his arrest, DeLangelo was also, get this, a former police officer, which added to an extra layer of shock to the case. In August 2020, DeLangelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and the sentence marking the conclusion of one of the most notorious unsolved criminal cases in US history. Number 3, Nathan Bedford Forrest. What a name. There's so many interesting names on this list. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a prominent Confederate general during the American Civil War. Unsurprisingly, given his culpability in the Fort Pillow Massacre in April 1864 and the formation of the Triple Ks, Forrest and his image may have come under attack by many sectors, especially from African Americans. The Triple Ks embarked upon a campaign of intimidation and violence against Southern blacks and Republicans until Forrest ordered the organization disbanded in 1869. Nevertheless, the local chapters of the Triple Ks continued to be active, and Forrest was ordered to appear before a congressional hearing in 1871, and his sometimes contradictory testimony, he denied he ever had membership in this organization. Yeah, he's the one who had the receipt. A combination of age, exhaustion, and conversation to Christianity may have caused the Forrest's fiery temper and racial attitudes to his moderate and later years. Number 2, Samuel Little. Apparently noted the most discreet but also most vile crime-committing killers. The reason why he was able to get away with over killing 93 women was because of the time or the height of these deaths. Majority, if not all of these women, were women of color who worked as adult workers. And because in the 70s, law enforcement didn't prioritize people of color or the occupation of working as an adult worker, any case of missing persons from both of these factions as a cohesive was met with dismissal. So Samuel, who had a bloodthirst for control and death, committed to these crimes only to these main demographics, and even admitted that once he was caught at a homeless shelter in Kentucky. Originally the arrest was over narcotics, but while they tested DNA, they found the link to his crimes that were left as cold cases. And he actually memorized all of the victims that he had killed. That's crazy. Number 1, Raymond Valdenlehero and John Heller. These men are hella messed up, and I'm not surprised, but it's also known that, yeah, that's pretty much why these guys are on this list. Specifically Raymond, he was a doctor who ran a research study to learn about the effects of syphilis on 400 African American men, also supposedly also 600 African men, around that range. The study began in 1932, and in the 1940s the cure of syphilis was discovered in penicillin. As a result, during the experimentation, the doctors didn't tell the patients they had syphilis and didn't even give them a cure. Even some of the subjects who have heard about penicillin, so the doctors gave them sugar pills and said that they were cured when they weren't. They even prevented 50s era public health campaigns to cure syphilis from operating in their area, and they told patients that the painful spinal taps and other procedures were free treatments. They did not allow patients to see any other doctors just in case those other doctors would cure them and mess up their so-called research. Many of the patients were drafted for World War II, and the military wanted to cure their syphilis and recruit them, which the researchers fought as best as they were able to, and the study finally ended in 1972. By that time, 128 of the men have died from syphilis, and the rest have been treated by military while they were drafted. Many of the children were born with syphilis-related birth defects, and more than that, born dead. The last victim of this gross and horrible experiment, also known as the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, was Ernest Hendon, who died on the 16th of January 2004. According to Fred Gray, a lawyer who represented victims of the study of the federal lawsuit, eventually the courts as well as the study of the law of the case brought to wild attention of the three that were unethical of the study. Evidently, the rights of the research subjects were violated. The Tuskegee study raised a lot of host of ethical issues such as informed consent, racism, patronism, unfair subject selection in research, maleficence, truth-telling, and justice, among others. The gross part that even though the research helped reduce syphilis, John got an award for it, despite the traumatizing things that he had done to the patients for life.
Number 10, Dracula. The man, the myth, the legend, Vlad the Impaler. This dude was so down bad, he was the inspiration for Dracula. There's really only one reason why he was so evil, and honestly, it's in his name. Vlad the Impaler liked to impale people, oftentimes alive. As if this was the worst thing thought up by a human being ever, he would leave the pikes on display, creating a horror only the eyes of medieval Europe could see. There's gonna be a lot of bad dudes on this list, some really saucy villains, unsavory characters who will make your skin crawl, but only Vlad has been bad enough to get a monster inspired by him, essentially turning his actions into somewhat of a spooky mythology. Dude gives off some serious goth energy. There's a few portraits of him, but if you look at it, he's got this stare in his eyes, like he wants to impale me or something. Vlad be nimble, Vlad be quick, just wait till you see his sharpened sticks. Number 9, the guy everyone knows. Look, YouTube won't let me say his name, but do we really have to? I mean, it's Mustache Man. Infamous for his bad art and lame book, he was the fascist leader of Germany. The very same leader who forced the world into World War II. Remember that one? Yeah, he's the very same monster who organized the destruction of Jewish peoples in Europe, and if he had his way, probably the whole world. I wouldn't be surprised if you showed a picture of him to anyone on Earth, any country, rich or poor, and they will most likely know who that was. That's the kind of evil that will get you talked about in classes all over the world, and likely for a long time. Eventually, he got what was coming to him, and the world had peace and prosperity, and there was never ever another bad stinky war ever again. Why is he not number 1, you might be asking? Well, that's just because his numbers don't compare to others, which is a very troubling statistic. I'll get to that later. Number 8, Busy Man. Most people on this list are not going to need any introduction. Genghis Khan is no exception to that. The Mongol warrior king saw his nomadic empire stretch thousands of miles, being one of history's largest empires. If you've been paying attention in history class, and you should have been, don't skip class or Big Ched will put you in the naughty corner. Bad. Yes, that's right, I just referred to myself in the third person. Speaking of third person, that's how many people Genghis unalived in his bloody conquests. Oh, did I say 3? I actually meant a lot. Did I say a lot? I actually meant a disturbing amount. Some people like to point out that he was accepting of other people's cultures and beliefs. Yes, that is true, but that's after he burned down the village right before he got to yours, and you got forcibly assimilated into his numbers. As you can also imagine, a bloodthirsty barbarian like him did not treat women with much respect. It's Genghis Khan, man. That's just how it do be. Number 7, so long, Bowser. Ivan the Terrible. Okay, sure, Vlad was called the Impaler, but you can kind of take that in a different way, right? Not in that way. All innuendos aside, with a name like Ivan the Terrible, it's kind of hard to work around that. Even as a child, Ivan was showing traits of an evil dictator, or supervillain really, as it's said that he would throw animals off of tall roofs in the same way that Mario throws Bowser off of platforms. Becoming the first Tsar of Russia and probably its worst, he's responsible for many horrors and crimes, but the most infamous being his responsibility for his own son's demise. After a heated argument regarding his unborn grandson, and in a binding fit of rage, Ivan claimed his son's life. Sure, dads get angry when sons don't help mow the lawns or help take out the trash, but that's going a little far. One minute you're having a fight with your dad, and the next minute you're being carried out by Ghanaian pallbearers. You know, the dancing guys, the memes, the casket, you know? Yeah, it's a joke.
Number 6, Brenda Spencer. I Don't Like Mondays is a song by Boomtown Rats and a famous quote by our favorite cat, Garfield. But for the 16-year-old Brenda Spencer, who the song Boomtown Rats is based off of, is one of that's very concerning. Brenda Spencer had killed 2 adults and wounded 8 children in a sniper attack on a San Diego elementary school in 1979. The reason, she said, it was just because she didn't like Mondays. And she had a very specific color that she liked, and if you were wearing it that day, you were shot. Her parents were separated when she was young, and she was left in the custody of her dad, and her father did try to bond with her after noting she had a knack for shooting birds with a BB he took on himself to get her a semi-automatic. Why? I don't know either. But he could have just taken her to like the mall or something. But apparently, according to Brenda, she said the reason why her dad got her the weapon was because she knew she was depressed and there was rumors that she wanted to take her own life. The morning of the event that took place is when her separated father left home and she was supposed to be at school, but it was noted by her teachers she had no interest in academics. And so she lived next to an elementary school, and when she saw the children and adults around, that's when she fired. Eventually, further casualties were reduced when the police moved a van that obscured her vicinity, and she was eventually apprehended. After a deep psych eval, she was pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 25 years to life. Number 5, Candace Elizabeth Newmaker. When you grew up in an unstable home, there are cases, if not most cases, especially if the child is unable to have any rehabilitation of security or sense of safety. The child, psychologically speaking, is, for the lack of a better word, traumatized. After Candace Elizabeth Newmaker's parents were caught for their negligence of Candace and her siblings, Child Protective Services took her away. As a result, she was later adopted by a single woman and a pediatric nurse named Jean Elizabeth Newmaker. But after months of adoption, Candace was reacting pretty not good, and she was very aggressive, according to Jean. She even killed her pet goldfish and started playing with matches. Keep in mind, this was all under the allegation of Jean, as she would also give Candace medication and take her to a psychiatrist due to her reckless behavior. In the year 2000, Jean took Candace to a pseudoscientist by the name of Cornell Watkins, who didn't have a license, to do a 2-week intensive attachment therapy program that cost $7,000. She found this so-called psychiatrist from another licensed psychologist named William Goebel. After 2 weeks, Candace died from the so-called rebirthing session, and the goal of this so-called rebirthing required an individual, in this case the child, to mimic a simulate womb covered by flannel sheets and pillows. Candace was held down by 4 adults where she was begging and pleading that she couldn't breathe. She yelled 11 times that she was dying, to which the people involved, named Julie Ponder, said go ahead and die right now, for real. After 20 minutes, Candace threw up, excreted inside the sheet, and despite, they still restrained her. 40 minutes after, they asked her if she wanted to be reborn, and she responded no. They yelled at her that she was a quitter, and at the end of the session she realized that she was motionless, her fingertips were blue, and Jean, who was watching the session from another room, took notice and tried to do CPR. They called 911, and when they were able to get a pulse, but eventually Candace died from being brain dead from asphyxia. Considering this was all videotaped, these so-called therapists were sentenced to prison sentences, convicted of reckless child harm. And after that, the US House of Rep passed Candace law in Colorado and North Carolina, preventing reenactments of the so-called birth experience. Number 4, Delphine LaLaurie. Delphine LaLaurie was also known as Madame LaLaurie, who was a New Orleans socialite of French Creole descent who lived in the 19th century. She is infamous for her association for one of the most notorious instances of cruel and harm in American history. So reports suggest that slaves who were owned by Delphi were found in a state of extreme physical harm and torment, as reportedly chained to walls. Others were confined in small cages, and others shown signs of severe mutilation. The exact details and extent of the atrocities vary in historical accounts, with some describing brutal experiments and inhumane treatment. As the news of the discovery spread, a mob of outraged citizens attacked the mansion. However, Delphi and her family managed to escape before facing any legal consequence, of course. After leaving New Orleans, Delphi's exact fate is unclear, as there are different accounts of where she went and what happened to her. The LaLaurie Mansion has also been noted as a haunted house, as ghost stories and legends, as it's also considered to be one of the most haunted places in New Orleans. Number 3, HJSY. If you were in Japan in the 70s, you might know this horrific and tragic story of Junko Furuta. A once motivated, popular, and beautiful high school student was headed home to watch the final episode of her favorite television show, Tombo, when suddenly 4 deviant, horrible high school boys by the name of Hiroshi Miyano, Joe Ogura, Shinji Minato, and Yasushi Watanabe abducted her and took Junko to Minato's home. There, they were extremely violent as they violated her and allowed other men to violate her as well. From the day of her kidnapping on November 25th to the day that she died on January 4th, under excruciating physical and psychological pain, she was tormented, beaten, lacerated, and even burned. Her appearance drastically deteriorated to the point where she even gave off a rotting smell. After beating and dropping an iron exercise ball in her stomach several times, burning her with hot candles and on her eyelids, forcing her to drink her own urine, Furuta succumbed to her injuries and she died. Less than 24 hours after realizing she had died, they wrapped her body in blankets, shoved her in a body and traveling bag, then placed her body in a 55 US gallon drum and filled it with wet concrete. They then dumped her body in a cement trunk in Tokyo, and after they were caught and convicted for another of kidnapping and physical harm to another woman, the boys accidentally confessed to the crime of Junko and told police where to find her body. She was finally found, and her parents and her classmates and her co-workers found peace, knowing she can finally be buried. But these horrible, crappy kids were only able to get less than a 10-year sentence, and even the mother of one of these horrible delinquents, Ogura, vandalized Furuta's grave, saying that the dead girl ruined her son's life. Which, to be honest, after these guys were released, they ended up doing more crime anyway and got arrested for that. Either way, the tragic crime of Junko Furuta had echoed as one of the most horrible crimes committed in Japan. Number 2, Gamal Pasha, also known as executioner of the Armenian genocide alongside other members of the CUP. During his tenure, Jamal Pasha implemented policies that would lead to the mass deportation and killing of Armenians. He is implicated in the forced marches, massacres, and other brutal actions that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Armenians. Pasha was also a key figure in the executions of genocidal policies set forth by the Ottoman government, and after World War I, Pasha fled the Ottoman Empire and sought refuge in Germany. In 1922, he was assassinated by an Armenian revolutionary named Teheran. Teheran was later tried and acquitted by German court, which recognized the massacre of the Armenians as a war crime. So that's good to know, the German court can recognize genocide as a war crime. Pasha's role in the Armenian genocide is remembered as one of part broader historical narrative surrounding the events of 1915 and 1923, during which the Ottoman Empire systematically targeted and killed a significant portion of Armenian population. The genocide remains as a historical debate, with Turkey officially denying the term genocide to describe these events. However, many countries and scholars around the world recognize that this was a genocide. Which, if anything, any nation that has the audacity to eradicate a nation of people by displacing them, cutting off their water, killing hundreds and thousands of their children, obliterating generations of family trees, and literally committing violence on civilians is a war crime. It is a genocide. Finally, number 1, King Leopold. Although he's a king, a lot of people seem to not know that the trauma inflicted this so-called king had as a significant role in Congo. Congo had suffered his horrible and vicious rule as Leopold acquired control over Congo's free state as his private property during the time when European powers were competing for territories in Africa. While officially presented as a philanthropic and humanitarian venture, Leopold's administration in the Congo was marked by exploitation and brutality. From forcing them by using methods of extracting resources that were often brutal, involving the use of violence, mutilation by cutting off their hands and feet by making them also stare at their lost appendages, and forced labor of the Congolese people. The atrocities committed during this period had been well documented, with the estimates of death toll ranging from several hundred thousands to millions. The harsh exploitations, along with the disease introduced by outsiders, led to significant decline of the people of Congo. Villages were ravaged and families were separated, contributing to the long-lasting impact of Congolese society. But was King Leopold ever accountable for his actions and his crime against the Congolese people? No, of course not. He was a European king, and like all colonizers, they always seem to get away with it. Even right now, Congo is going through a massive genocide as they are forced to mine for natural resources and minerals like cobalt for your cell phones. 70% of the world's cobalt for laptops, jet engines, rockets, cameras are all from the mines in Congo, and who's mining them? Children. In 1996, over 6 million have been killed, and half of them are children. As there are currently 6.9 million people have been displaced, these crimes in Congo since Leopold still remain, and the tech industry are deeply complicit in the injustices in Congo.